They say a man doesn't know what he has until it's gone, but that's a comfortable lie we tell ourselves to justify stupidity. Nathaniel Blackthorne knew exactly what he had, a wife who would have walked through fire for him, and he threw it away anyway because he confused obsession with love and familiarity with emptiness. Now here he stands in the wreckage of his own making, watching the woman he destroyed shine brighter without him than she ever did beside him. And the bitter truth is this: some men don't deserve second chances, and some losses should haunt you forever. What happens when a man who had everything realizes too late that he traded gold for painted glass? Stay with me until the end, because this is the kind of ruin that starts with arrogance and ends with a silence so complete it swallows you whole. The morning of Nathaniel Blackthorne's destruction began like any other, with his wife's absence. He didn't notice at first. The Duke of Blackthorne rarely noticed anything about Evelyn unless it inconvenienced him, and her quiet departure from their bed before dawn had become so routine over the past year that the empty space beside him felt more natural than her presence ever had. He woke to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Blackthorne Manor, stretched across Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than most families earned in a month, and rang for his valet without once wondering where his Duchess had gone. Thomas appeared within minutes, his face professionally blank as he laid out Nathaniel's riding clothes. "The Duchess is in the morning room, Your Grace," Thomas said without being asked. Nathaniel grunted. "Tell her I'll be riding with Lord Pemberton this morning. I won't need breakfast." "Very good, Your Grace." The valet's voice held no inflection, no judgment, but Nathaniel caught the slightest hesitation before Thomas turned away. It irritated him in a vague, unfocused way that he didn't bother to examine. Servants always had opinions they thought they were entitled to, as if proximity to nobility gave them insight into matters beyond their station. He dressed quickly and took the servant's stairs down to avoid passing the morning room entirely. Evelyn would be sitting there with her tea and her correspondence, writing thank-you notes for some charity function or another, being perfectly gracious and perfectly boring. 5 years of marriage had taught Nathaniel that his wife's capacity for tedious propriety knew no bounds. The stables smelled of hay and leather and horse sweat, honest smells that reminded him of his youth before duty, and expectations had caged him inside a role he'd never wanted. His stallion, Obsidian, tossed his head as the grooms saddled him, eager for the run. Nathaniel understood that eagerness. He felt it too, the desperate need to escape the suffocating weight of being the Duke of Blackthorne, if only for a few hours. "Beautiful morning for it," Pemberton called out as his own mount was brought around. He was already astride, his round face flushed with the exertion of hoisting himself into the saddle. "Weather's been abysmal lately. Good to finally get some sun." Nathaniel swung up onto Obsidian with the easy grace of a man who'd been riding since he could walk. "I need the air. The manor feels like a tomb these days." "Evelyn not brightening your days, eh?" Pemberton laughed, that knowing laugh men shared when discussing wives they found tiresome. "Mine's been after me about the season. Wants to throw a ball. As if we need another excuse for the vultures to peck at our coffers." They rode out through the estate gates, past the manicured gardens that Evelyn had restored when they were first married. She'd spent months working with the head gardener, choosing plantings that would bloom in sequence throughout the year. Nathaniel remembered being annoyed by how much time she devoted to it, as if arranging flowers was somehow meaningful work. The memory soured his mood further. "I think we married the wrong women," he said, more bitterly than he'd intended. "Mine's perfectly pleasant, perfectly dutiful, perfectly insufferable in her perfection." Pemberton chuckled. "They all are, old boy. It's what they're raised for. Grace and propriety and making us look good at parties. Can't fault them for being what they were bred to be." But that wasn't quite it, Nathaniel thought, as they cantered across the open fields of his estate. It wasn't that Evelyn was dutiful. Plenty of wives were dutiful without making their husbands feel like they were slowly suffocating. It was something else, something he couldn't articulate even to himself. She looked at him with such steady devotion, such unshakable faith in his goodness, and it made him feel like a fraud. Because he wasn't good. He'd never been good. He'd married Evelyn because she was suitable. Impeccable breeding, modest dowry, pretty enough without being threatening, and most importantly, willing. His father had approved the match. His mother had approved the match. Society had approved the match. Everyone had been very pleased with how well he'd done for himself, landing Evelyn Ashford with her gentle disposition and her family's old name. No one had asked if he loved her. No one had asked if he wanted to. They'd been married 3 months when Nathaniel had seen Vivian Sterling again at the theater. She'd been standing in the Ashworth box, laughing at something Lord Ashworth had said, and the sight of her had punched the air from Nathaniel's lungs. 10 years since he'd last seen her, since his father had ended their engagement and arranged his marriage to Evelyn instead, and Vivian was still the most captivating woman he'd ever laid eyes on. That night, he'd barely heard the opera. He'd sat beside Evelyn in their box, watched her watch the performance with polite attention, and felt the cage of his marriage lock shut around him with finality. 4 years later, he still couldn't get Vivian out of his mind. "You're thinking about her again," Pemberton said, pulling his horse alongside Nathaniel's. "I can always tell. You get this look." Nathaniel didn't ask who he meant. "She's been at every event this season. It's impossible to avoid her." "Then don't avoid her." Pemberton shrugged with the carelessness of a man who'd never loved anyone more than he loved his own comfort. "Everyone knows Ashworth married her for her father's shipping connections. He's twice her age and barely notices she exists. If you want the woman, take her. It's not as if your marriage is a love match." The casual cruelty of it should have bothered Nathaniel, should have made him think of Evelyn sitting in the morning room, writing her thank you notes with patient care, should have reminded him that his wife had done nothing to deserve his contempt except fail to be the woman he'd wanted. Instead, it felt like permission. "Evelyn would be devastated," he said, testing the words. "Evelyn would survive. Women always do." Pemberton pulled up his horse near the edge of the woods. "Look, I'm not saying throw it in her face, but you're the Duke of Blackthorn. You're entitled to certain accommodations. It's practically expected in our circles." Nathaniel knew that was true. Half the men in his club kept mistresses. Some of them paraded their lovers through society with barely concealed pride, while their wives smiled bravely and pretended not to notice. It was the way of things, the price women paid for security and status. But Evelyn wouldn't smile bravely. She'd break quietly, the way she did everything, with dignity and grace and that terrible silent devastation he'd seen in her eyes the few times he'd been needlessly cruel. The thought should have stopped him. It didn't. The Ashworth Ball was the event of the season, the kind of ostentatious display of wealth that made even other aristocrats raise their eyebrows. Crystal chandeliers imported from Venice, champagne from France, an orchestra of 30 musicians, and enough roses to blanket half of England. Evelyn had spent the afternoon getting ready with her lady's maid, enduring the careful arrangement of her hair and the lacing of her corset with patient stillness. Nathaniel had barely looked at her when she'd emerged from her dressing room. She wore deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her eyes, her mother's diamonds at her throat, her dark hair swept up to reveal the graceful line of her neck. She looked beautiful in that quiet, understated way she always did, like morning light through curtains, easily overlooked and easily forgotten. "You look lovely," he'd said, the words automatic and empty. She'd smiled at him with such genuine pleasure that it had made him feel vaguely sick. Now they stood in the Ashworth ballroom making small talk with Lord and Lady Pemberton, and Nathaniel could feel Vivian's presence like a magnetic pull, even though he hadn't seen her yet. Evelyn stood beside him with her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm, playing her part perfectly as always, smiling and nodding and saying exactly the right things to exactly the right people. "The Duchess has been absolutely instrumental in our literacy program," Lady Pemberton was saying. "The number of children we've been able to reach has doubled since she joined the committee." Evelyn ducked her head modestly. "It's important work. Every child deserves to read." "Spoken like a true philanthropist," Lord Pemberton boomed. "Your wife's a credit to you, Blackthorn. A credit." Nathaniel murmured something appropriate and felt Evelyn's fingers tighten slightly on his arm. A small gesture of affection, of connection, of the quiet intimacy she still tried to maintain between them despite his coldness. He wanted to shake her off. Then he saw Vivian across the ballroom, and everything else ceased to exist. She wore crimson. Of course she did. Vivian had always loved making an entrance, and she moved through the crowd like a flame, drawing every eye, commanding attention without effort. Her hair was piled high in an elaborate style that showed off the rubies at her ears and throat. And when she laughed at something Lady Ashworth said, the sound carried across the room like music. "Excuse me," Nathaniel said abruptly. "I need to speak with Ashworth about a business matter." Evelyn's hand fell away from his arm. "Of course." He didn't look back at her as he crossed the ballroom, didn't see the way her smile faltered, didn't notice Lady Pemberton's pitying glance or the whispers that started rippling through the crowd as people marked his trajectory toward Lady Ashworth with knowing looks. Vivian saw him coming. Her eyes met his across the distance, and something electric passed between them. Recognition, memory, all the passion they'd shared before his father had ripped them apart. "Your Grace," she said when he reached her, her voice low and intimate despite the public setting. "What a delightful surprise." "Lady Ashworth." He bowed over her hand, holding it a fraction too long. "You're radiant tonight." "Am I?" She tilted her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "How kind of you to notice." The words were innocent enough for public consumption, but the heat beneath them was unmistakable. Lord Ashworth was deep in conversation with a group of men near the card room, oblivious to his wife's flirtation. Nathaniel let himself drown in Vivian's dark eyes, in the familiar scent of her perfume, in the fantasy of what might have been if his father hadn't valued political alliance over his son's happiness. "Dance with me," he said. It wasn't a request. "I'd be delighted," Vivian replied, taking his offered arm. They swept onto the dance floor together, and Nathaniel forgot to care that half the ballroom was watching them with sharp interest. Forgot that his wife was standing by the windows with her patient smile, watching him choose another woman in front of everyone who mattered. Forgot everything except the feeling of Vivian in his arms, the way they'd always moved together like two parts of the same whole. "You've been avoiding me," she murmured as they turned through the waltz. "I've been trying to do the right thing." "And how's that working for you?" He pulled her infinitesimally closer, pressing the boundaries of propriety. "Miserably." She laughed, that same laugh he'd fallen in love with when they were both too young to know better. "You married her because your father told you to. That doesn't mean you have to stay miserable." "She's my wife, Vivian." "And I should have been." The words were fierce, years of bitterness compressed into a single sentence. "We should have been together. We still could be." The waltz ended. They stood in the middle of the dance floor, holding each other while couples flowed around them, and Nathaniel made the choice that would destroy everything. "Meet me," he said, "tomorrow. The old hunting lodge on the east side of my estate, 2:00. Vivian's eyes glittered with triumph. "I'll be there." He escorted her back to Lady Ashworth and went to find Brandy, his heart pounding with the reckless euphoria of a man jumping off a cliff. Somewhere in the crowd, Evelyn was watching. He could feel her gaze like a physical weight, but he didn't look for her. Didn't want to see what his betrayal had done to her face. That would come later. Evelyn stood by the tall windows overlooking the Ashworth Gardens and tried to remember how to breathe. She'd known this was coming. In her heart, she'd known from the moment Vivian Sterling had reappeared in London society that Nathaniel would drift back toward his first love like a compass finding north. She'd seen it in the way he looked at Vivian across crowded rooms, the way he found excuses to be wherever she was, the way he'd grown even more distant at home until Evelyn felt like a ghost haunting her own marriage. But knowing and seeing were different things. Watching her husband dance with another woman, watching him look at Vivian the way he'd never once looked at her, watching him choose public humiliation over even the pretense of loyalty, that was a different kind of pain. The kind that hollowed you out from the inside until you were nothing but a shell in an emerald dress, smiling politely while your world collapsed. "My dear," Lady Pemberton said softly, appearing at Evelyn's elbow. "Perhaps you'd like some air. The gardens are lovely." It was kindly meant, a graceful exit from her own humiliation. Evelyn wanted to take it, wanted to flee into the darkness and let the tears fall where no one could see them. But she was the Duchess of Blackthorn, and duchesses didn't run. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the screaming inside her chest. "The ballroom is rather warm tonight, though, isn't it?" "Stifling," Lady Pemberton agreed, playing along with the fiction that heat was the problem. Men never notice these things, too busy with their brandy and their cards. And their mistresses, Evelyn thought. Too busy with women who laughed like music and wore crimson dresses and made them forget they had wives waiting at home. She stayed another 2 hours because leaving early would have been an admission of defeat. She danced with Lord Pemberton and Lord Ashworth and half a dozen other men who asked out of pity or politeness. She made conversation about the weather and the season and the Queen's latest fashion choices. She played her part with the same grace she brought to everything, and if her smiles felt like lies painted on her face, well, no one seemed to notice. Nathaniel never came back to her side. She watched him from across the ballroom, laughing with Lord Ashworth set, drinking too much, carefully not looking in her direction. The cut was deliberate, the message clear. She was an embarrassment, an inconvenience, a wife he'd been saddled with against his will. She'd known that too. Had known it from the first night of their marriage when he'd come to her bed out of duty and left the moment it was done. Had known it through 5 years of careful distance, of polite coldness, of the 1,000 small ways he'd made it clear she was tolerated but not wanted. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. The carriage ride home was silent. Nathaniel sat across from her with his eyes closed, probably drunk, probably thinking about Vivian. Evelyn looked out the window at London passing by in shadows and lamplight and wondered when she'd become so pathetic. When had she accepted this half-life of patient devotion to a man who'd never wanted her? When had she convinced herself that loving him enough might eventually make him love her back? What a stupid, childish hope that had been. They arrived at Blackthorn Manor past midnight. Nathaniel climbed out of the carriage without offering her his hand, without waiting to walk her inside, disappearing into the house like she didn't exist. Evelyn followed more slowly, her legs aching from standing in heeled slippers for hours, her head pounding from the effort of not crying. Her lady's maid was waiting in her chambers, ready to help her undress. Evelyn stood still as the emerald dress was unlaced and lifted away, as the diamonds were removed and returned to their case, as the careful arrangement of her hair was unpinned and brushed out. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger, a woman who'd spent 5 years trying to be perfect for a man who didn't care. "Will you need anything else, Your Grace?" the maid asked. "No, thank you. You may go." Alone, finally, Evelyn sat at her dressing table in her nightgown and let herself feel it. The humiliation, the rejection, the bone-deep exhaustion of loving someone who couldn't love you back. Tears came then, silent and hot, tracking down her face while she stared at her reflection. She'd been 18 when she married Nathaniel, fresh from her debut season, thrilled that the handsome Duke of Blackthorn had chosen her out of all the eligible girls. She'd believed in fairy tales then, believed that marriage was the beginning of a grand romance, that she just needed to be good enough, dutiful enough, loving enough, and her husband would eventually see her worth. 5 years had taught her better. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, crying for the death of dreams she should have abandoned years ago. Long enough for the house to fall silent, long enough for the moon to track across her windows, long enough to feel the last fragments of hope crumble into dust inside her chest. A knock at her door made her straighten, hastily wiping her face. "Come in." It was Nathaniel. He stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his cravat undone, swaying slightly. Definitely drunk then. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, and when he looked at her, she wasn't sure he actually saw her. "I need to tell you something," he said. Evelyn's heart clenched. This was it. This was the moment he'd ask for a divorce, or a formal separation, or permission to openly keep Vivian as his mistress. She gripped the edge of her dressing table and waited for the final blow. "I'm going to the hunting lodge tomorrow. Don't wait dinner for me." That was it. That was all he'd come to say. He turned to leave. "Nathaniel," she heard herself say, "please don't do this." He paused, his back to her. "Don't do what?" "Don't throw away our marriage for something that ended 10 years ago." "Our marriage?" He laughed, the sound ugly and bitter. "Is that what you call this? This polite fiction we've been performing for half a decade? I call it a commitment. I call it the vows we made before God and everyone we know. Vows my father forced me to make. Vows I never wanted." He turned to face her then, and the casual cruelty in his eyes was worse than hatred. At least hatred was a kind of passion. This was just emptiness. "You want honesty, Evelyn? Here it is. I don't love you. I have never loved you. You were the suitable choice, the safe choice, the choice that pleased everyone except me." The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to wound. Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been holding her together through sheer force of will. "I've been a good wife to you," she said quietly. "I've done everything you asked, been everything you needed." That's the problem. He walked toward her and she could smell the brandy on his breath. "You're so damned perfect at being what I need that you've never once been what I want. You're a duchess. You're a charitable saint. You're a flawless ornament I can trot out at parties to prove what a respectable man I am. But you're not her." Vivian. Always Vivian. She doesn't love you, Evelyn said. She loves your title, your money, the scandal of taking you from your wife. And what do you love? The prestige of being a duchess? The security of my name? I love you. The words came out broken, pathetic. I have loved you from the day we met. I've loved you through every cold word, every dismissal, every night you've chosen anywhere but our bed. I've loved you even though you've never given me a single reason to. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or pity, or the distant echo of a conscience he'd been steadily drowning in brandy and resentment. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same cold indifference. Then you're a fool, he said, because I can't give you what you want. I can't manufacture feelings that don't exist, and I'm tired of pretending. He left then, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that felt more final than slamming it would have. Evelyn sat very still in the silence that followed, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the shaking that threatened to tear her apart. She thought about her mother's advice before the wedding. A woman's strength is in her endurance. You'll love him through the difficult times, and eventually he'll see your worth. Her mother had been wrong. There was no endurance left in her, no strength, no hope. Just the hollow recognition that she'd wasted 5 years of her life trying to earn love from a man who viewed her as an obligation, and she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't watch him choose Vivian tomorrow, couldn't sit in this manner pretending everything was fine while he conducted an affair everyone knew about, couldn't keep breaking herself into smaller and smaller pieces trying to fit into a space he refused to make for her. She stood up on shaking legs and went to her writing desk, drew out a piece of her personal stationery, dipped her pen in ink. The letter took her an hour to write, crossing out words and starting over until she'd said everything that needed saying without dissolving into the desperate pleading her heart wanted to spill across the page. When she was finished, she sealed it with wax and her personal signet, then set it on Nathaniel's pillow. Then she packed. Not everything. That would take servants and attention she didn't want. Just the essentials. A trunk of dresses. Her jewelry. The few personal items that mattered. Her mother's prayer book. The pressed flowers from her wedding bouquet that she'd kept like a fool. The letters from her father before he'd passed. Her lady's maid found her in the gray light of dawn, surrounded by half-packed trunks. Your Grace, Margaret breathed. What are you doing? I'm leaving. Leaving? But where will you go? My aunt's estate in Ashbury. She's been asking me to visit for years. Evelyn closed the trunk and looked at Margaret steadily. I need you to arrange a carriage, quietly. I'll be gone before the household wakes. Does His Grace know? He will soon enough. Margaret's face crumpled with the kind of sympathy that made Evelyn's composure threaten to shatter. Oh, Your Grace, I'm so sorry. Everyone knows about Lady Ashworth. It's shameful how he's treating you. Don't, Evelyn said softly. Don't pity me. Just help me leave with my dignity intact, please. The carriage was ready within the hour. Evelyn walked through Blackthorn Manor one last time, trailing her fingers along the walls she'd tried so hard to make into a home. The morning room where she'd spent countless hours. The library where she'd hoped Nathaniel might join her for quiet evenings. The portrait gallery where their wedding painting hung, both of them young and hopeful and headed toward disaster. She didn't look back as the carriage pulled away, carrying her toward whatever came next. Behind her, Nathaniel slept late into the morning, dreaming of Vivian and already planning his afternoon at the hunting lodge. He didn't find Evelyn's letter until nearly noon, and when he did, he read it with more irritation than concern. Nathaniel, I'm leaving because staying would destroy what little of myself I have left. You've made it clear I'm unwanted, and I won't force my presence on someone who finds it burdensome. I release you to pursue whatever happiness you believe Lady Ashworth can provide, though I suspect you'll find it's built on different lies than ours was. I don't hate you. I can't hate someone I've loved as completely as I've loved you, but I also can't watch you anymore. Can't endure the casual cruelty you don't even recognize as cruelty because you've never cared enough to notice what your indifference does to me. I hope you find what you're looking for. I truly do. But I won't be here when you realize it wasn't what you needed. Evelyn. He read it twice, standing in his dressing room while his valet waited with his riding clothes. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, already dismissing it as the dramatic gesture of a wounded wife, who'd be back within a week once she'd made her point. Evelyn would come home. Women always did. He had more important things to think about. At 2 o'clock, He rode to the hunting lodge where Vivian was waiting, and the affair that would ruin his life began in earnest while his wife's carriage carried her further away with every mile, heading toward a future that had no space for the Duke of Blackthorn in it at all. Nathaniel had always believed that desire and satisfaction were the same thing, that wanting something badly enough meant having it would finally quiet the restlessness that had lived in his chest since boyhood. He was wrong about that, the way he'd been wrong about everything else that mattered, but he wouldn't understand that for months yet, not until the hunting lodge afternoons with Vivian had rotted from passion into routine, not until the rumors had spread so thick through London that even he couldn't ignore them, not until he stood in the ruins of his own making and realized too late that some hungers don't get fed, they just grow sharper. The first month after Evelyn left was the easiest because Nathaniel barely noticed she was gone. He woke in empty beds and ate solitary breakfasts and spent his afternoons at the lodge with Vivian, drowning in the kind of reckless physical intensity he'd convinced himself was love. She met him there 3 times a week, sometimes 4, slipping away from Lord Ashworth's indifferent household to the secluded stone building on the edge of Nathaniel's estate where they could pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. It felt like vindication at first, like reclaiming something that had been stolen from him 10 years ago when his father had ended their engagement. Every time Vivian laughed in his arms, every time she whispered that she'd never stopped loving him, it reinforced the story he'd been telling himself. That he'd married the wrong woman, that Evelyn had been a mistake imposed by duty, that real passion couldn't be manufactured through propriety and vows. He ignored the fact that Vivian never asked about his life beyond their stolen hours, never asked about his estate management or his seat in Parliament or any of the responsibilities that filled his days. She wanted the fantasy version of him, the young man who'd loved her before obligation had complicated everything, and he was happy to perform that role, because it meant he didn't have to think about the growing problems everywhere else. Thomas packed away Evelyn's things from the Duchess's chambers without comment, though Nathaniel caught the valet's disapproving silence every time he returned from the lodge smelling of Vivian's perfume. The other servants developed the same careful neutrality, going about their duties with faces that revealed nothing while the gossip undoubtedly spread through the household like wildfire. Nathaniel told himself he didn't care what they thought. He told himself Evelyn would come crawling back once she'd finished sulking at her aunt's estate. He told himself a lot of comfortable lies that first month. The cracks started showing in the second month when Lord Pemberton pulled him aside at White's and said, "Your wife's been gone 6 weeks now. People are starting to talk." Nathaniel had been 3 glasses deep into excellent brandy, loose-limbed and unconcerned. Let them talk. Evelyn needed time to accept reality. She'll come around. Pemberton's round face had gone serious in a way that cut through the alcohol haze. "That's not what they're saying, old boy. They're saying you drove her away for Lady Ashworth, that you humiliated her publicly, and she had too much pride to endure it." "So what?" Nathaniel had drained his glass and signaled for another. "Half the men here keep mistresses. Why is everyone so scandalized when I do it? Because you didn't keep it discreet, you bloody fool. You danced with Vivian Sterling in front of the entire Ashworth ball while your wife watched. You made it a spectacle." The words had stung more than Nathaniel wanted to admit, partly because they were true, and partly because he'd been too drunk on forbidden romance to notice he'd crossed a line. There were rules about these things, unspoken but ironclad. You could have your affairs as long as you protected your wife's dignity in public, as long as she could maintain the fiction that everything was fine. He'd blown past those rules without a second thought, and now London society was reassessing him. Still, he'd convinced himself it would blow over. Scandals always did. Give it a few weeks, and someone else would do something outrageous enough to shift attention away from the Duke of Blackthorn's marital troubles. Then the invitations started drying up, not all at once, not obviously enough to call it a direct cut, but slowly, steadily, the flood of social obligations that had defined his calendar began to thin. The Weatherby ball that he'd attended for years suddenly had a conflict with the date. Lady Morrison's garden party was family only this year. The Cunningham dinner was at capacity, so sorry. He mentioned it to Vivian one afternoon at the lodge, half joking about how fickle society could be. She'd been sprawled across the bed they'd just thoroughly occupied, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she'd laughed that musical laugh he'd once found enchanting. "They're protecting their reputations. Nobody wants to be seen endorsing your behavior." "My behavior?" He'd pulled on his shirt, suddenly irritated. "You're the one who's married to someone else, too. I'm a woman. Different rules." She sat up, wrapping the sheet around herself with calculated modesty. Besides, Ashworth doesn't care what I do as long as I'm discreet about it. You're the one who made it a public circus. The accusation in her tone caught him off guard. I thought you wanted this. Wanted us. I wanted you to be smart about it. Her eyes had gone hard in a way he'd never seen before, all the softness of their postcoital intimacy evaporating. I wanted you to handle your wife quietly so we could continue without every gossip in London watching our every move. Handle my wife. The phrase sat wrong in his mouth. Evelyn's not some problem to be managed. She's… What? Your Duchess? Vivian's smile was sharp. She was convenient, Nathaniel, suitable, safe. Everything you resented about the marriage your father forced on you. Don't pretend she meant more than that just because she had the sense to leave before you pushed her out. He'd left the lodge earlier than usual that day, driving his curricle too fast through the estate roads while Vivian's words circled in his head like carrion birds. She was right. She had to be right. Because admitting she was wrong meant admitting he'd destroyed his marriage for a woman who viewed him as carelessly as he'd viewed Evelyn. The thought was too uncomfortable to sit with, so he drowned it in more brandy and told himself everything would settle once the gossip died down. It didn't die down. By the third month, the rumors had metastasized from whispered scandal into open judgment. Women he'd known for years gave him cut direct at the opera. Men he'd considered friends made excuses to avoid him at the club. His mother wrote a scathing letter demanding to know what he thought he was doing, dragging the Blackthorne name through the mud for some tawdry affair with Vivian Sterling, of all people. The irony is you could have married her 10 years ago if you'd had a spine, his mother had written in her precise, cutting script. Your father would have relented if you'd fought for it. Instead, you accepted Evelyn without protest, and now you've decided she's inadequate because she had the misfortune of not being your first choice. You're a coward, Nathaniel, and cowards make terrible dukes. He'd burned the letter in the fireplace of his study and opened another bottle. The estate books were a disaster he'd been ignoring for months, maybe longer. His steward had been trying to get his attention about falling revenues and rising costs, about tenant complaints and necessary repairs, but Nathaniel kept putting off the meetings. There would be time to deal with business matters later, after the social situation stabilized, after Evelyn came home and gave him the cover of respectability again. Except Evelyn didn't come home. Her aunt's estate in Ashbury was apparently quite comfortable, according to the few reports that filtered back through mutual acquaintances. The Duchess of Blackthorne was staying indefinitely. She seemed in good spirits. She'd joined the local parish charity work and was making quite an impression on the community. The information came third-hand and sparse, but each tidbit felt like a small rejection. She was building a life without him. Not dramatically, not with any grand gestures of independence, but quietly, the way she did everything. Just erasing him from her daily existence as if 5 years of marriage could be discarded without difficulty. It should have relieved him, should have made the affair with Vivian simpler, cleaner, free of guilt. Instead, it gnawed at him. He started drinking earlier in the day, started missing parliamentary sessions he'd never have skipped before, started showing up at the lodge disheveled and smelling of yesterday's brandy, desperate for Vivian to look at him the way she had in the beginning, like he was everything she'd ever wanted. But the way she looked at him was changing too. You need to pull yourself together, she said one afternoon in late summer when he'd arrived 2 hours late and halfway to drunk. This isn't attractive, Nathaniel. I'm having a difficult time. His words slurred slightly. Society's being brutal. Because you're making it easy for them. She was already dressing, buttoning her gown with brisk efficiency. You're the Duke of Blackthorne. Act like it. Get your wife back. Make a public reconciliation. Restore your reputation. Then we can continue more carefully. He stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. You want me to reconcile with Evelyn? I want you to stop being pathetic. Vivian turned to face him, and her expression held none of the tenderness he'd convinced himself she felt. You're losing everything. Your standing, your influence, your self-respect. I didn't risk my own reputation for a man who can't hold himself together under a little social pressure. This isn't a little pressure, Vivian. I'm being ostracized. Then fix it. She picked up her cloak. Grovel to your wife if you have to. Make it look good for society. But stop wallowing like this. It's beneath you. She left him sitting on the edge of the bed in his unbuttoned shirt, staring at the closed door and trying to understand when exactly the passionate reunion of star-crossed lovers had curdled into this transactional coldness. The realization that Vivian had never loved him, had only loved what he represented, the status and security and scandalous excitement of stealing a duke from his duchess, should have devastated him. Instead, it just made him angrier, at himself mostly, for being stupid enough to believe her performance, for throwing away a wife who'd actually cared about him in pursuit of a fantasy he'd built in his own head, for proving his mother right about being a coward, but also at Evelyn, which made even less sense but felt easier than the alternative. This was her fault somehow. If she'd been different, more exciting, less perfectly dutiful, he wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. If she'd fought for him instead of leaving with that quiet dignity, maybe he'd have realized what he was losing. If she'd just come back and fixed the mess her absence had created, he could stop feeling like he was drowning in consequences he didn't fully understand. He started writing her letters. The first one was defensive, barely coherent, written at 2 in the morning after a dinner at Pemberton's where he'd been seated at the far end of the table like a social pariah. Evelyn, your prolonged absence is causing significant damage to both our reputations. Whatever grievances you have with me, surely we can discuss them like reasonable adults. I expect you home by the end of the month. Nathaniel. She didn't respond. The second letter was angrier, more demanding. Your childish tantrum has gone on long enough. You have responsibilities here as my duchess. I will not be held hostage to your wounded pride. Return immediately, or I'll be forced to take more serious measures. Still nothing. The third letter he wrote drunk and never should have sent, but Thomas found it on his desk and posted it anyway. I don't understand what you want from me. I never promised you love. You knew what this marriage was when you agreed to it. You want me to grovel? Fine. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I wasn't the husband you fantasized about. But you're punishing me for being honest about my limitations, and that's not fair. Please come home. We can work this out. That one got a response, but not from Evelyn. Her aunt, Lady Ashbury, sent a tersely worded note through her solicitor informing the Duke of Blackthorn that Her Grace the Duchess preferred not to receive any further correspondence at this time, and that any necessary communications regarding the marriage should be directed through appropriate legal channels. Legal channels. The words hit like cold water. She was talking to solicitors, building walls, making this permanent in ways that went beyond hurt feelings and temporary separation. Nathaniel had always assumed she'd forgive him eventually because that's what wives did. They endured. They forgave. They came back. Evelyn apparently had different plans. He confronted Pemberton about it over cards at White's, his hands shaking slightly as he dealt. What the hell am I supposed to do? She won't talk to me, won't read my letters. She's got her bloody aunt running interference like I'm some kind of threat. Pemberton studied his cards with the careful neutrality of a man trying to avoid giving offense. Maybe she needs more time. It's been 4 months, and how long did you flaunt Vivian Sterling before she left? I wasn't flaunting anything, Nathaniel snapped. I was trying to find some happiness in a marriage that never should have happened, then let her go. Pemberton met his eyes across the table. If the marriage was such a mistake, let Evelyn have her freedom. You've got what you wanted, Vivian, or whatever's left of that affair. Let your wife have peace. The suggestion made Nathaniel's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to panic. I can't just let her go. She's my wife. She belongs to Blackthorn. Belongs? Pemberton's expression soured. You're talking about a woman like she's property, Blackthorn. That's the kind of thinking that got you into this mess. She made vows. So did you. How are you honoring them? Nathaniel threw down his cards and left the club, rage and shame churning in his gut in equal measure. Everyone had opinions suddenly. Everyone wanted to tell him what he'd done wrong, how he should fix it, why he was the villain in a story that was far more complicated than they understood. None of them had lived his life. None of them had been forced into a marriage they didn't want. None of them understood what it felt like to wake up every day next to someone you'd chosen out of duty instead of desire and feel the weight of that compromise crushing you slowly. He went to the lodge looking for Vivian, needing her to remind him why he'd made the choices he'd made, why destroying his marriage had been worth it. She wasn't there. He waited for 2 hours, drinking the brandy he kept stocked in the lodge and watching the sun sink through the windows. She didn't come, didn't send word, just abandoned him to his spiral without explanation. When he finally staggered back to Blackthorn Manor past dark, Thomas was waiting in the entrance hall with a silver tray. Letter for you, Your Grace. From Lady Ashworth. Nathaniel's hands fumbled with the seal, hope and dread fighting in his chest. The note was brief. Nathaniel, I think it's best we end this arrangement. You've become too dependent, and I have no interest in managing your emotional state. It was exciting for a while, but you're not the man I thought you were. Lord Ashworth and I are departing for the continent for the winter. Please don't contact me again. V. He read it 3 times, waiting for the devastation to hit. It didn't come. Just a hollow kind of recognition that he'd destroyed his marriage for a woman who'd never seen him as anything more than a diversion. And now he had nothing. No wife, no mistress, no reputation, no respect. Just the echoing silence of Blackthorn Manor and the growing pile of unpaid accounts his steward kept trying to make him address. The 4th month became the 5th, and Nathaniel stopped pretending he had control of anything. The estate finances were worse than he'd realized. Years of neglect and extravagant spending had created a crisis that required immediate attention. Tenant cottages needed repairs. Drainage systems were failing. Debts were mounting faster than revenues could cover them. His steward, a patient man named Harrison, who'd served the Blackthorn estate for 30 years, finally cornered him in the study with a stack of ledgers and a grim expression. Your Grace, we need to discuss the financial situation. It's reached a critical point. Not now, Harrison. When then? The steward's voice held an edge Nathaniel had never heard before. When the creditors start seizing assets? When we can't pay the staff? When the tenants revolt because their homes are falling down around them? I said not now. With respect, Your Grace, it has to be now. Harrison dropped the ledgers on the desk with a heavy thud. Her Grace used to handle much of the estate management, the household accounts, the tenant relations, the charity obligations. Since she left, everything's fallen apart because you haven't stepped in to fill that gap. Evelyn had done all that? Nathaniel tried to remember ever paying attention to what his wife did with her days, beyond the vague awareness that she was always busy with something charitable and boring. She kept this estate running while you focused on Parliament and other pursuits. Harrison's disapproval was subtle but unmistakable. Now she's gone and you haven't replaced her organizational capabilities. We're hemorrhaging money and you don't seem to care. I care. Then prove it. The steward's eyes were hard. Sit down and go through these books with me. Make the decisions that need making. Or find a way to bring your wife home because she's the only reason this estate functioned as well as it did. Nathaniel wanted to argue that it wasn't his fault Evelyn had left, that she was the one who'd abandoned her responsibilities, that Harrison had no right to speak to a duke with such insubordination. But the words died in his throat because they all knew the truth. He'd driven her away. He'd been so focused on his own misery and his fantasy of Vivian that he'd never noticed Evelyn was holding together the practical reality of their lives. Never appreciated that her quiet competence was the only thing preventing the kind of disaster that was now crashing down around him. Fine, he said, dropping into his chair. Show me. They spent 6 hours going through the books, and with every page, Nathaniel felt his carefully constructed narrative of himself as the wronged party crumble further. Evelyn had been managing an operation that touched hundreds of lives. Tenant families who depended on the Blackthorn estate for their livelihoods. Staff who relied on timely wages. Charitable organizations that counted on her patronage. All of it organized with meticulous care in her neat handwriting. Budgets balanced, expenditures tracked, obligations met. She'd been running a small kingdom while he'd been feeling sorry for himself about being trapped in a marriage he didn't want. Your Grace, Harrison said as midnight approached and they finally reached the bottom of the pile. You need to make a choice. Either commit to learning how to do this yourself or convince your wife to return. Because without one or the other, Blackthorn won't survive another year. The stark assessment should have galvanized him into action. Instead, he just felt tired. Tired of fighting battles he didn't understand. Tired of being judged by people who didn't know what it was like to be him. Tired of the constant low-grade panic that something essential was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't figure out how to hold on. He started spending more time in the study going through the estate business, forcing himself to understand the systems Evelyn had built. It was mind-numbing work that he had no aptitude for, and he resented every minute of it while simultaneously gaining a grudging respect for how much his wife had carried without ever complaining. The social exile continued. London had fully turned against him now, the whispers no longer even bothering to be discreet. He'd become a cautionary tale. The Duke who'd destroyed his marriage for a woman who didn't want him, who'd humiliated his Duchess publicly and then couldn't understand why society disapproved. His mother stopped writing entirely, which was somehow worse than her scathing letters. Pemberton still tolerated his presence at the club, but with a wariness that suggested their friendship had limits Nathaniel was approaching. And through it all, Evelyn remained in Ashbury, living her quiet life and apparently doing just fine without him. The reports that filtered back were maddeningly vague, but consistently positive. The Duchess was thriving. The Duchess had started a literacy program for tenant children. The Duchess had been invited to dine with Lord Ashbury and his family. Wait, Lord Ashbury? Nathaniel had been half drunk when Pemberton mentioned it, sitting in the club library where fewer people could witness his deterioration. She's been spending time at the neighboring Ashbury estate, Pemberton said carefully. Lord Ashbury's son recently returned from his medical work abroad. Apparently he and the Duchess have been collaborating on some charitable project. Nathaniel's hand tightened around his glass. What kind of project? Something about health care for rural populations. Pemberton watched him warily. It's all very proper, Blackthorne. Don't go imagining scandals where there aren't any. But the seed was planted. The idea that Evelyn might be moving on, might be building a life that included other men, even in a professional capacity, ignited something primitive in Nathaniel's chest. Something that felt like ownership and entitlement and the belated recognition that he'd thrown away something valuable. He told himself it was concern for propriety, that as her husband, he had a right to know who she was associating with. That 6 months of separation didn't give her license to involve herself with strange men. The truth, which he couldn't quite admit even to himself, was simpler and uglier. He couldn't stand the thought of someone else seeing value in Evelyn when he'd spent 5 years treating her like an obligation. He wrote another letter, this one supposedly about estate business, but really just an excuse to remind her she was still his wife. Evelyn, the estate requires your attention to several administrative matters. Your prolonged absence has created complications that cannot be resolved without your input on household management. I suggest we schedule a meeting at Blackthorne Manor to discuss these issues. Nathaniel. The response came a week later, and it wasn't from Evelyn. It was from a solicitor in London, a Mr. Whitfield, whose firm specialized in aristocratic domestic disputes. The letter was professionally courteous and absolutely devastating. Your Grace, I write on behalf of Her Grace the Duchess of Blackthorne regarding your recent correspondence. The Duchess has asked me to inform you that she has no intention of returning to Blackthorne Manor for any purpose. All administrative matters you mentioned can be handled through written correspondence directed to this office. Furthermore, the Duchess wishes to make clear that while she has no immediate plans to seek legal separation, she considers the marriage effectively concluded and asks that you respect her privacy and refrain from further direct contact. Your Grace's cooperation in this matter would be appreciated. The words hit like a physical blow. She'd hired a solicitor. She was building formal barriers between them. She was treating their marriage like a business arrangement that had reached the end of its useful term. And the worst part, the part that made Nathaniel's hand shake as he read the letter a second time, was that she wasn't being vindictive about it, wasn't demanding anything, wasn't punishing him beyond the simple act of removal. She was just done with him, done with trying, done with the patient devotion he'd taken for granted and then trampled when it became inconvenient. He crumpled the letter and threw it across the study, then immediately retrieved it and smoothed it out again because it was evidence, proof that he'd actually managed to push away the one person who genuinely cared about him. The rational response would have been to respect her wishes, to let her have the peace she was asking for, to focus on salvaging what remained of his estate and his reputation and accept that some mistakes couldn't be undone. Nathaniel had never been particularly good at rational responses. Instead, he got drunk and made plans to go to Ashbury himself, to force a confrontation that would somehow make Evelyn see reason. In his brandy-soaked logic, if he could just talk to her face to face, explain that he understood now, that he was sorry, that he needed her, surely she'd relent. Surely she'd forgive him the way wives were supposed to forgive. Pemberton talked him out of it. Don't, the older man said flatly when Nathaniel announced his intentions. Don't show up on her doorstep like some obsessed fool. You'll only make it worse. How could it possibly be worse? Because right now she's maintaining dignity and distance. If you chase after her, you'll look desperate and she'll look justified in everything she's done. Pemberton leaned forward, his face unusually serious. You want her back? Prove you've changed, fix your estate, rebuild your reputation. Show her through actions, not words, that you're worth reconsidering. I don't have time for that. The creditors are circling, the estate's falling apart. Then you should have thought about that before you threw away the woman holding it all together. The brutal honesty of it sobered Nathaniel faster than coffee ever could. He spent the next month trying to do what Pemberton suggested, throwing himself into estate management with grim determination, cutting unnecessary expenses, meeting with tenants, forcing himself to care about drainage ditches and crop rotations, and all the tedious details that kept a duchy functioning. It was exhausting work that made him appreciate just how much Evelyn had been doing without recognition or thanks. But it wasn't enough. The financial hole was too deep, the social damage too extensive. Every time he thought he'd made progress, some new crisis would emerge. A major tenant threatening to leave, a supplier demanding immediate payment, a scandal sheet running another story about the disgraced Duke of Blackthorn and his abandoned Duchess. Winter came early that year, and with it a cold that seeped into Blackthorn Manor's bones and made the emptiness more obvious. The house had always been large, but with Evelyn gone it felt cavernous. Her absence echoed in every room she used to occupy, every space she'd tried to make warm and welcoming. The morning room where she'd handled correspondence, the library where she'd read by the fire, the gardens she'd restored that were now falling back into neglect without her attention. All of it reminded him that he'd had something precious, and he'd ground it into dust through sheer selfish stupidity. The breaking point came in early December. Nathaniel was in his study going through another round of impossible financial decisions when Thomas knocked and entered with unusual formality. "Your Grace, there's a gentleman here to see you. A Dr. Adrian Whitmore from Ashbury." The name sent ice through Nathaniel's veins. The son. Lord Ashbury's son. The one who'd been collaborating with Evelyn on charitable work. Send him in. Dr. Whitmore was everything Nathaniel wasn't, confident without arrogance, dressed well but not ostentatiously, with the kind of steady competence that came from actually helping people instead of just commanding them. He was perhaps a few years older than Nathaniel, with gray at his temples and the weathered look of someone who'd seen real hardship. "Your Grace," Whitmore said with a polite nod. "Thank you for seeing me. I didn't have much choice." Nathaniel didn't offer him a seat. "What do you want?" "I wanted to discuss the Duchess." Whitmore's directness was almost refreshing. "I've been working with her on several charitable initiatives in Ashbury, and I believe you should know that she's planning to expand those projects significantly. Why would I care about her charity work? Because it's going to require substantial financial commitment. Resources she'll be drawing from Blackthorn Holdings." Whitmore's eyes were sharp. "I thought you should be aware before she formally requests the funds through her solicitor." The audacity of it struck Nathaniel speechless for a moment. "She's planning to spend my money?" "Her money, technically. The Duchess's portion is outlined in your marriage settlement." Whitmore pulled out a folder. "I've brought documentation of the projects she's supporting. They're all legitimate charitable works that will significantly benefit the region." Nathaniel took the folder but didn't open it, too busy trying to process the fact that this stranger knew more about his wife's activities and intentions than he did. "You seem very invested in my wife's charity work, Doctor." "I'm invested in helping people. The Duchess has proven to be an exceptional partner in that endeavor. She's intelligent, compassionate, and deeply committed to making a real difference." Whitmore's expression softened slightly. "She's also one of the finest people I've had the privilege of knowing." The words were simple, stated as fact without any romantic undertone, but they hit Nathaniel like a gut punch. This man, this country doctor who'd known Evelyn for a few months, recognized her worth in a way Nathaniel had failed to for 5 years. "Get out," Nathaniel said quietly. "Your Grace." "Get out of my house." Whitmore studied him for a long moment with something that might have been pity, then nodded and turned to leave. He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, the Duchess never speaks ill of you. She's remarkably kind when discussing your marriage, far kinder than most people would be in her position. You might want to consider what kind of person treats someone who hurt them with such grace." Then he was gone, leaving Nathaniel alone with the folder and the crushing realization that he'd lost more than he'd ever understood. He opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were detailed plans for a literacy program, a healthcare initiative, and a women's refuge, all ambitious, all carefully budgeted, all bearing Evelyn's meticulous organizational touch. At the bottom was a note in her handwriting, clearly meant for Whitmore, but somehow even more devastating for not being addressed to Nathaniel. Adrian, thank you for believing in this work. For the first time in years, I feel like what I do matters. Like I matter. That's a gift I didn't know I needed. Nathaniel read it 3 times, each word carving deeper into the hollow space in his chest where certainty used to live. She'd found purpose without him. She'd found people who valued her. She'd found a life where she mattered, and none of it had anything to do with being the Duchess of Blackthorn. And he had no idea how to compete with that, because he'd never given her any of those things himself. He sat in his study as darkness fell, the folder open in front of him, and finally understood what he'd done. He hadn't just lost a wife. He'd lost the only person who'd ever looked at him and seen someone worth loving, and he'd thrown that away for a fantasy that had evaporated the moment it became real. The question now was whether there was any way to fix it, or if some damage went too deep to ever be repaired. Power is a strange thing. You never realize how much of it depends on other people's willingness to pretend you have it until they stop pretending. Nathaniel had spent his entire life believing his title was armor, that being the Duke of Blackthorn meant something immutable and permanent. But titles are just words people agree to respect, and respect can evaporate faster than morning dew when you give them reasons to withdraw it. He was about to learn that lesson in the cruelest way possible, standing in a ballroom watching his wife shine beside another man while everything he'd taken for granted crumbled to dust around him. And the worst part wasn't the public humiliation. It was the private recognition that he'd engineered his own destruction so thoroughly that even he couldn't find a way to blame anyone else. The invitation to the winter gala arrived in mid-January, delivered by royal messenger with all the pomp that suggested refusing wasn't an option. Nathaniel stared at the heavy cardstock with its gold embossing and felt his stomach drop. He hadn't been invited to a major social event in months, not since society had collectively decided he was persona non grata for the Vivian affair and the abandonment of his duchess. The fact that this invitation came directly from the palace meant someone with real power wanted him there. The question was why. Thomas helped him dress for the event with the same professional efficiency he'd always shown, but Nathaniel caught the valet's concerned glances in the mirror as he struggled with his cravat for the 3rd time. His hands were shaking, had been shaking for weeks now, a tremor he couldn't quite control that got worse when he was stressed or hadn't been drinking. "You look well, Your Grace," Thomas lied smoothly. Nathaniel barked out a bitter laugh. "I look like hell, and we both know it." He did look like hell. The past 7 months had carved lines into his face that made him look a decade older. His clothes hung looser than they should because he kept forgetting to eat. His eyes had the hollow quality of someone who wasn't sleeping enough, wasn't sleeping well, was spending too many nights staring at the ceiling wondering how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. The palace ballroom was already packed when Nathaniel arrived, glittering with the cream of London society in their finest clothes and their sharpest judgment. He felt the shift in atmosphere the moment he entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence, heads turning, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. The disgraced Duke had arrived. He kept his spine straight and his expression neutral, playing the role he'd been trained for since birth, even though every instinct screamed at him to turn around and flee. Pemberton caught his eye from across the room and gave him a slight nod, not quite approval but at least acknowledgement. It was more support than Nathaniel had expected. "Your Grace," a voice said behind him, "how unexpected to see you here." Nathaniel turned to find Lord Ashworth, Vivian's husband, regarding him with the cold amusement of a man who'd won a battle without ever having to fight it. Ashworth was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of wealth that made titles almost irrelevant. "Lord Ashworth." Nathaniel forced civility into his tone. "I could say the same about you. I heard you'd gone to the continent for the winter. Plans change." Ashworth's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My wife and I decided London offered better entertainment this season. Though I suppose you wouldn't know much about my wife's whereabouts these days, would you?" The barb landed exactly as intended. Nathaniel felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. "I'm sure Lady Ashworth is well." "Oh, she's excellent. Currently in Paris with her mother, spending quite a lot of money." Ashworth sipped his champagne with deliberate slowness. "But then, that's what mistresses do when they've outlived their usefulness. They extract maximum value before moving on to the next fool willing to pay for their attention." The casual cruelty of it, the public acknowledgement of what everyone had been whispering about for months, made Nathaniel's face burn. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that what he'd had with Vivian was more than a financial transaction, but the words died in his throat because they both knew it was a lie. If you'll excuse me, Nathaniel said stiffly. Of course. Ashworth's expression was all polite malice. Do enjoy the evening, Your Grace. I suspect it will be memorable. Nathaniel moved through the ballroom in a daze, accepting champagne from a passing servant and draining it faster than was proper. The alcohol did nothing to dull the sick feeling in his stomach, the growing certainty that something was about to happen, and he was walking into it blind. Then the crowd near the entrance shifted, and Nathaniel's entire world stopped. Evelyn stood in the doorway in a gown of midnight blue silk that caught the light like water. Her dark hair swept up to reveal the graceful column of her neck, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. She looked radiant in a way he'd never seen before, confident, poised, but more than that. She looked happy. And beside her, offering his arm with easy familiarity, was Dr. Adrian Whitmore. The sight hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He'd known intellectually that Evelyn had been spending time with Whitmore, had even met the man briefly when he'd come to discuss her charitable work. But seeing them together like this, seeing the way she smiled up at the doctor, the way her hand rested comfortably on his arm, the way they moved through the crowd with the ease of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, that was different. That was devastation. The whispers around Nathaniel intensified, voices barely bothering to lower as people tracked his reaction. Is that the Duchess? I barely recognized her. She looks wonderful. With Dr. Whitmore, yes. Apparently they've been working together on some remarkable projects in Ashbury. My cousin says he's a widower. Very respectable. Devoted his life to helping the poor. Well, he certainly seems devoted to the Duchess now. Look at how he's looking at her. Nathaniel couldn't look away. Couldn't stop watching as Evelyn and Whitmore made their way through the ballroom, greeting people with warmth and grace, receiving smiles and congratulations that had nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with genuine affection. This was what Evelyn had become without him. This was who she was when she wasn't trying to win love from a man determined not to give it. She hadn't seen him yet, was laughing at something Whitmore had said, her whole face lighting up with unguarded joy, and Nathaniel felt something crack in his chest because he'd never made her laugh like that, had never made her look that happy, had spent 5 years treating her presence like an obligation and her devotion like an inconvenience. Pemberton appeared at his elbow, his round face grim. Don't make a scene, Blackthorne. I'm not going to make a scene. Then why do you look like you're about to do something spectacularly stupid? Because I am, Nathaniel thought, but didn't say. Because watching his wife, shine beside another man was apparently the thing that finally broke through the protective shell of denial and self-pity he'd been living in for months. He started across the ballroom before Pemberton could stop him, moving through the crowd with single-minded determination. People stepped aside, their conversations faltering as they realized what was about to happen. Evelyn saw him coming when he was still 10 feet away. Her smile faltered, her hand tightening on Whitmore's arm, and Nathaniel watched something like resignation cross her face. Not fear, not anger, just the tired acknowledgement of an unpleasant inevitability. Evelyn, he said when he reached them, his voice coming out rougher than intended. Your Grace. Her tone was polite, distant, the way she might address any acquaintance at a social function. How unexpected to see you here. The formality of it stung worse than any insult. Your Grace. Not Nathaniel. Not even the cold husband she might have used in anger. Just the title. Creating distance between them as effectively as a moat. I need to speak with you. I don't think that's appropriate. Evelyn's eyes were steady, unflinching. If you have matters to discuss, please direct them through Mr. Whitfield, her solicitor. She was citing her damn solicitor at him in the middle of a palace ballroom. This is your husband, he ground out, aware that half the room was watching them. Not some business associate you can dismiss through lawyers. You're absolutely right. Whitmore's voice was calm, measured, infuriating in its reasonableness. You are her husband, which makes your behavior toward her over the past year even more inexcusable. Nathaniel turned on him, rage flooding his system with welcome heat. This is none of your concern, Doctor. The Duchess's well-being is very much my concern. Whitmore didn't flinch, didn't back down, just met Nathaniel's glare with steady conviction. She's worked incredibly hard to build a life of meaning and purpose. I won't stand by while you try to drag her back into the misery you created. You have no right. I have every right. Whitmore stepped forward slightly, positioning himself subtly between Nathaniel and Evelyn. The right of someone who actually values her. who sees her extraordinary capabilities and wants to support them instead of diminishing them. The implication was clear, brutally clear, and Nathaniel felt something primal and possessive roar to life in his chest. "You're sleeping with my wife." "Adrian," Evelyn said sharply, her hand on Whitmore's arm now restraining rather than resting. "Don't know," Whitmore said, his eyes never leaving Nathaniel's. "Let's be very clear about something, Your Grace. I respect the Duchess far too much to presume anything beyond friendship while she's still legally bound to you. But if she were free, if she chose to seek an annulment or separation, I would consider it the greatest honor of my life to court her properly." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Nathaniel felt the ballroom spinning, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching his humiliation, felt the last shreds of his dignity being stripped away in front of everyone who mattered. And underneath all of that was a terrible clarity. Whitmore wasn't the villain here. Wasn't even competition, really. He was just a decent man who'd recognized value in someone Nathaniel had been too blind and too selfish to appreciate. "Evelyn?" Nathaniel tried again, his voice cracking slightly. "Please? Can we talk?" "Just 5 minutes." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her eyes that might have been pity. It made him feel smaller than any amount of anger would have. "What would we talk about, Nathaniel? What could you possibly say that would change anything? I was wrong." The admission felt like swallowing glass. About everything. About you. About us. About what matters. "I've spent the past 7 months watching everything fall apart and realizing too late that you were the only thing holding it together. So you want me back now that your estate is failing and your reputation is ruined?" She said it flatly, without inflection. "Now that I might be useful to you again?" "No." "Yes." "I don't know." He was making this worse, could feel it spiraling out of his control, but couldn't stop. I need you to understand that I see it now. See what I threw away." "You threw away a wife who loved you," Evelyn said quietly, "who would have stood beside you through anything, who tried so hard to be enough for you, even though we both knew I never would be. And now that I've stopped trying, now that I've found people who actually appreciate me, you suddenly care? I always cared." "No." Her voice was firm now, cutting through his desperate lies. "You cared about what I represented, the perfect Duchess, the suitable wife, the woman who made you look good to society while you pursued what you actually wanted. You never cared about me." The truth of it silenced him completely. "I'm done being your safety net, Nathaniel." She straightened her spine, and Nathaniel was struck by how much she'd changed, how much strength had been hiding beneath the patient compliance he'd mistaken for weakness. "I'm done waiting for you to see my worth. I found it myself, and I'm not giving it back so you can feel better about your mistakes." She turned to Whitmore, and the softness that came into her expression made Nathaniel's chest ache. "Shall we go find Lady Ashbury? I promised her we'd discuss the refuge project." "Of course." Whitmore offered his arm again, and she took it without looking back at Nathaniel. They walked away together, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the middle of the ballroom while whispers erupted around him like wildfire. He could feel the judgment, the satisfaction people were taking in watching the proud Duke of Blackthorn get exactly what he deserved. Pemberton materialized beside him again. "Come on, let's get you out of here before this gets worse." How could it possibly get worse? Trust me, it can always get worse. But it turned out Pemberton was wrong about that, because worse was waiting for Nathaniel back at Blackthorn Manor in the form of Harrison, his steward, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as representatives of his largest creditors. The meeting took place in Nathaniel's study, the same room where he'd been trying to make sense of the estate finances for months now. The creditors laid out the situation with brutal efficiency. The debts had reached critical mass, payments were months overdue, and they were no longer willing to extend credit based on the Blackthorn name alone. "Your Grace," the senior creditor said with professional courtesy that barely masked contempt, "we require immediate settlement of the outstanding amounts, or we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies." Legal remedies. Seizure of assets, public auction of Blackthorn holdings, the complete destruction of everything his family had built over generations. "I need time," Nathaniel said, hating how desperate he sounded. "The estate has value. I just need to liquidate some properties. Time is what you've had for the past year while you were otherwise occupied." The creditor's expression was implacable. "Time has run out, Your Grace. What are my options?" "Realistically? Sell the estate. Auction the contents. Use the proceeds to settle debts and hope there's something left over." The man pulled out a stack of documents. Alternatively, you could seek financial rescue from family connections. A wealthy marriage, perhaps, though given your current circumstances, I'm not certain what prospects might be available. The implication was clear. He'd destroyed his reputation so thoroughly that no respectable family would tie themselves to the Blackthorn name now. His only value had been his title and his estate, and he was on the verge of losing both. I'll need to consult with my solicitors, Nathaniel said weakly. You have until the end of the month. After that, we file with the courts. They left him sitting in the wreckage of his study, surrounded by ledgers that testified to his complete failure at every level that mattered. He'd lost his wife, lost his mistress, lost his reputation and his standing, and now he was about to lose the physical embodiment of his heritage. The brandy was already open on his desk. He poured 3 fingers and drank it straight, welcoming the burn. Harrison cleared his throat. Your Grace, there might be one option we haven't explored. Nathaniel looked up, desperate for any lifeline. What? The Duchess's dowry funds. When she married, her family settled a significant amount in trust. Technically, those funds could be accessed with her permission for estate emergencies. The suggestion made Nathaniel's stomach turn. You want me to ask Evelyn for money? Not want, Your Grace, but it's the only liquid asset large enough to satisfy the creditors quickly enough to prevent seizure. She'll never agree. You saw how she looked at me tonight. Then convince her. Harrison's expression was grim. Because the alternative is losing Blackthorn entirely. Nathaniel spent the night drinking and trying to figure out how he'd sunk this low. How the powerful Duke of Blackthorn had been reduced to begging his estranged wife for financial rescue after spending months treating her like an inconvenience he'd been right to discard. But when morning came and the hangover cleared enough for him to think, he realized he had no choice. He couldn't lose Blackthorn. Couldn't watch his family's legacy get auctioned off to satisfy debts he'd accumulated through negligence and distraction. Couldn't face his ancestors knowing he'd been the Duke who destroyed everything they'd built, even if it meant swallowing every bit of pride he had left. The letter to Evelyn took him 3 days to write, going through draft after draft until he'd found words that didn't sound quite as pathetic as he felt. Evelyn, I'm writing to request a meeting to discuss urgent financial matters regarding the estate. I know you have no reason to help me, but the situation has become dire enough that I'm asking anyway. If you have any remaining affection for Blackthorn Manor itself, for the history and the people who depend on it, please consider meeting with me. Nathaniel. The response came back within a week, but it wasn't from Evelyn. Mr. Whitfield, her solicitor, wrote with chilly professionalism that the Duchess was willing to meet regarding estate matters, but only with legal representation present at a neutral location with a clear agenda provided in advance. It was the most humiliating negotiation of Nathaniel's life. They met at Whitfield's offices in London, Evelyn sitting across a mahogany conference table flanked by her solicitor while Nathaniel sat alone because he could barely afford his own legal counsel anymore. She looked composed and distant, like she was attending a business meeting rather than confronting her husband. Nathaniel laid out the financial situation as clearly as he could, watched her face remain neutral as he explained how the debts had mounted, how the creditors were threatening seizure, how her dowry funds might be the only thing preventing complete disaster. When he finished, silence hung heavy in the room. Finally, Evelyn spoke. You spent the first 5 years of our marriage ignoring me, and the last 7 months actively destroying everything I built. Now you want me to use my family's money to save you from the consequences of your own negligence? The bluntness of it made Nathaniel flinch. I'm not asking for myself, I'm asking for Blackthorn. For the tenants who'll lose their homes if the estate is seized, for the staff who've served our family for generations. Our family. She repeated the words with bitter emphasis. You mean your family? The family you made very clear I was never really part of. That's not— Yes, it is. She cut him off sharply. Don't rewrite history now that it suits you. You told me I was the suitable choice, the safe choice, the choice that pleased everyone except you. Those were your words, Nathaniel. He had no defense because she was right. Evelyn turned to her solicitor. Mr. Whitfield, what are the legal implications if I refuse? The estate would likely be seized and auctioned, Whitfield said calmly. The Duchess would lose her marital home, but wouldn't be personally liable for debts incurred by the Duke's mismanagement. Her dowry funds would remain protected. And if I agree to release the funds? You'd be voluntarily liquidating assets to satisfy debts you have no legal obligation to pay. I would strongly advise against it unless you receive substantial considerations in return. Evelyn looked at Nathaniel across the table, her green eyes measuring him with the same careful assessment she might give any business proposition. What are you offering in exchange? Nathaniel's throat was dry. What do you want? An annulment. She said it without hesitation, without emotion, like she'd been planning this moment for months. Full dissolution of the marriage. You publicly acknowledge that the union was a mistake from the beginning and release me with my reputation intact. The words hit him like a sledgehammer. You want to end the marriage. I want my freedom. She leaned forward slightly. I'll release my dowry funds to save Blackthorn on the condition that you grant me an annulment, allow me to keep my personal property without contest, and never contact me again except through legal channels. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Her voice was steady, final. Those are my terms. Accept them or manage your financial crisis yourself. Nathaniel felt the walls closing in, felt the last escape route being sealed off. If he agreed, he lost Evelyn permanently, not just physically but legally, severing every tie that bound them. If he refused, he lost everything else. What about children? He asked desperately. What if we won't? Her face was stone. We haven't shared a bed in over a year, Nathaniel. We're not going to have children together. But an annulment means declaring the marriage void, like it never happened. Exactly. She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. You have 1 week to decide. After that, my offer expires and you can face your creditors alone. She walked out with Whitfield, leaving Nathaniel sitting in the conference room with the wreckage of his pride scattered around him. He spent the next 6 days trying to find alternatives, tried to secure loans from other sources, tried to sell properties quickly enough to raise funds, tried to call in favors from friends who were suddenly too busy to see him. Every door slammed shut in his face. On the 7th day, he went back to Whitfield's office and signed the papers agreeing to the annulment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was trading his marriage for the estate he'd already sacrificed his marriage to neglect. Giving up Evelyn to save Blackthorn, when losing Evelyn was what had destroyed Blackthorn in the first place. It was the kind of circular devastation that would have been funny if it wasn't his life. The funds transferred within days, saving the estate from immediate seizure. The annulment proceedings began shortly after, quiet and efficient, handled through legal channels designed to minimize scandal for families who preferred their failures private. Nathaniel signed every document put in front of him with a numb detachment, watching his marriage dissolve into legal language and witness signatures. The final papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February. Thomas brought them to the study where Nathaniel had been drinking since before dawn, trying to find the bottom of his second bottle. The annulment is finalized, Your Grace. The valet's voice was gentle. She's no longer your wife. Nathaniel took the document with shaking hands and read the official declaration that his marriage to Evelyn Ashford had been voided, erased from legal recognition as if it had never existed. 5 years reduced to nothing. 5 years of her patient devotion, her quiet strength, her endless attempts to build something meaningful between them, all of it officially declared a mistake that never should have happened. He'd wanted that once, had resented the marriage from the beginning, had told her to her face that he'd never wanted to marry her. Now it was true in every sense that mattered, and the victory felt like drowning. Thomas cleared his throat. There's something else, Your Grace. A package. From the Duchess. Former Duchess, Nathaniel corrected bitterly. She's not that anymore. The package was small, wrapped in plain paper. Inside was a leather journal he recognized immediately, Evelyn's personal diary from their first year of marriage. A note was tucked inside the front cover in her precise handwriting. Nathaniel, I'm returning this to you because I don't need it anymore. I kept it during our marriage because I thought someday you might want to understand what you meant to me, what I hoped we could build together. But you've made it very clear that my hopes were never realistic, and I'm done mourning possibilities that were only ever in my head. I've moved on. I suggest you do the same. The woman you married doesn't exist anymore. She was an illusion we both participated in for different reasons. I'm someone else now, and that someone wants nothing to do with the Duke of Blackthorn. I wish you well, but from a very great distance. Evelyn. Nathaniel opened the journal with trembling hands and started reading. The first entry was dated 3 days after their wedding, written in the hopeful script of a young woman who'd believed in fairy tales. Today Nathaniel took me riding through the estate. He barely spoke to me, but I'm sure he's just nervous. Men handle emotions differently than women. I'll be patient. I'll show him that I can be the wife he needs. Surely love will grow between us if I just try hard enough. He read entry after entry, watching her hopes slowly erode over months and then years. Watched her make excuses for his coldness, his distance, his casual cruelties. Watched her blame herself for his dissatisfaction, convinced that if she could just be better, more interesting, more useful, he'd eventually see her worth. The entry stopped abruptly 6 months before she'd left. The final one dated the night after the Ashworth ball. I watched my husband choose another woman in front of everyone who matters, and I smiled through it like my heart wasn't breaking. I'm done. Done pretending this will ever be anything but painful. Done hoping he'll wake up one day and see me. Done breaking myself into smaller pieces trying to fit into a space he refuses to make for me. I deserve better than this. I deserve to be loved by someone who actually wants to love me. I'm leaving. Not because I'm angry, not because I want to punish him, but because staying is killing me slowly, and I finally love myself enough to walk away. Nathaniel closed the journal and sat in his study surrounded by the empire he'd sold his soul to save, and finally understood what he'd lost. Not just a wife, not just a marriage, but a woman who'd loved him completely when he'd done nothing to deserve it, who'd given him endless chances to be better than he was, who'd stood beside him through years of indifference and neglect and still found reasons to hope. He'd traded that for Vivian's lies and his own selfish pride, and now both were gone, and he was left with nothing but the bitter recognition that some mistakes don't get fixed, some betrayals don't get forgiven. Some loves, once lost, never return no matter how desperately you want them back. The estate was saved but empty, the title was intact but meaningless, and the Duke of Blackthorn sat alone in the silence he'd created, holding the diary of a woman who'd stopped existing the moment she'd stopped loving him, and realized that this hollow victory, this Pyrrhic salvation, was what happened when you mistook control for power and possession for love. He'd gotten exactly what he deserved, which turned out to be absolutely nothing at all. There's a peculiar clarity that comes with losing everything, not the romantic kind that people write about in books, but the raw, visceral understanding that you've burned every bridge and salted every field, and now you're standing in the wasteland of your own making with nothing left but the choice of who you're going to become in the aftermath. Nathaniel had spent months thinking he'd hit bottom, but bottom turned out to be a place with trapdoors leading to deeper hells. And the diary sitting on his desk was the key to the lowest one yet, because it forced him to see exactly what he'd destroyed, and exactly how deliberate that destruction had been. The question now wasn't whether he could fix what he'd broken, that ship had sailed and sunk and rotted on the ocean floor, but whether he had the spine to face the truth without the comfortable cushion of self-deception he'd been wrapping around himself like armor since the day he'd chosen Vivian's fantasy over Evelyn's reality. Nathaniel read the diary 3 times in 2 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, just absorbing the slow-motion tragedy of a woman trying to love someone who'd decided she wasn't worth the effort. The entries were devastating in their honesty. Evelyn had chronicled every small kindness he'd shown her, so few they could be counted on one hand, and magnified them into evidence that he cared. She'd made excuses for his coldness that were more generous than he deserved. She'd blamed herself for his wandering attention, convinced that if she could just be smarter, prettier, more interesting, he'd eventually look at her the way she looked at him. She'd loved him with the kind of wholehearted devotion most men would kill for, and he'd treated it like an obligation he resented. By the 3rd reading, Nathaniel was sick with self-loathing so profound it felt like drowning on dry land. He'd thought he was the victim in their marriage. The man trapped by duty, forced to marry a woman he didn't love, entitled to seek happiness elsewhere because the arrangement had been imposed on him. He'd built an entire narrative around his own suffering, painted himself as the martyr, sacrificing his desires for family expectations. The diary destroyed that fiction completely, because the truth was simpler and uglier. He'd been a coward who'd taken the easy path his father offered and then blamed everyone else when it didn't magically transform into the passionate romance he'd lost with Vivian. He'd punished Evelyn for not being someone else, resented her for the choice he'd made, and convinced himself his cruelty was justified because he'd never promised to love her. As if vows meant nothing, as if commitment was negotiable, as if treating another human being with basic decency required some kind of prior emotional attachment. Thomas found him on the 3rd night, passed out at his desk with the diary open and an empty bottle beside him. The valet had seen Nathaniel at his worst over the past months, but something about this scene seemed to genuinely worry him. Your Grace, you need to eat something. Sleep in an actual bed. Nathaniel looked up with eyes that felt like sandpaper. Did you know? Know what, Your Grace? That she loved me. That she tried so hard. Did everyone know except me? Thomas's silence was answer enough. Why didn't you say something? Nathaniel's voice cracked. Why didn't anyone tell me I was destroying someone who deserved better? With respect, Your Grace, it wasn't our place. And even if it had been, you wouldn't have listened. The valet's tone was gentle but unflinching. You saw what you wanted to see. We all watched it happen, but you were the only one who could have changed it. The brutal honesty of it should have made Nathaniel angry. Instead, it just made him tired. He spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions of managing the estate that Evelyn's money had saved, hating every minute of it because the whole thing felt like a monument to his failure. The tenants whose homes he'd preserved, the staff whose wages he could still pay, the legacy he'd protected. All of it bought with the dignity of a woman he'd systematically broken down over 5 years until she'd had no choice but to leave or lose herself completely. The spring exhibition opened in early March, one of the season's major social events where London's elite gathered to view art and be seen viewing art. Nathaniel had no intention of attending, his social exile was still firmly in effect, but Pemberton appeared at Blackthorn Manor with a determined expression that suggested refusing wasn't an option. You're going, Pemberton said flatly. You're going to put on proper clothes, act like a duke instead of a drunk, and start rebuilding your life. There's nothing left to rebuild. Then build something new. Pemberton's round face was unusually stern. I've watched you wallow for months, Blackthorn. It was understandable at first. You made catastrophic mistakes and faced consequences, but this sustained self-destruction isn't penance, it's cowardice. The word hit like a slap. Nathaniel's mother had called him a coward too, and he was starting to think they were both right. What's the point? Society's made it clear I'm persona non grata. Society has a short memory for scandals when you give them something new to talk about. Pemberton pulled out a newspaper. Have you seen the morning edition? Nathaniel took it with numb fingers. The society page featured a drawing of Evelyn and Dr. Whitmore at some charitable event, looking happy and purposeful. The caption identified her as Mrs. Evelyn Ashford, philanthropist and patroness of rural healthcare initiatives. Not Duchess, not Blackthorn, just Ashford. Her maiden name, reclaimed. She's moved on, Pemberton said quietly. Built a whole new life. The question is whether you're going to spend the rest of yours staring at what you lost, or whether you're going to prove you learned something from it. What am I supposed to learn? That I'm capable of destroying someone who loved me? That I traded gold for garbage and lost both? That you're capable of being better than you were? Pemberton's expression softened slightly. Look, I'm not saying you deserve forgiveness. You probably don't. But you deserve the chance to become someone who might eventually deserve it, even if it never comes. The logic was twisted enough to make sense. Nathaniel let Thomas dress him in clothes that had been tailored when he still cared about appearances, before the weight loss and the drinking had made everything hang wrong. He looked like a scarecrow version of himself in the mirror, all sharp angles and hollow eyes, but at least he was upright. The exhibition was packed with everyone who mattered, and Nathaniel felt the familiar shift when he entered, conversations pausing, heads turning, whispers starting. But this time something was different. The judgment in the air felt less sharp, more curious, as if society was reassessing whether his punishment had gone on long enough. Pemberton stayed close, running interference with his usual social grace, making introductions that gave people permission to acknowledge Nathaniel without fully embracing him. It was exhausting work, performing normalcy when everything inside him felt shattered, but Nathaniel forced himself through it. Then he saw them across the gallery. Evelyn stood in front of a massive landscape painting, her head tilted slightly as she studied it, and beside her was Whitmore with his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The gesture was casual, familiar, suggesting a level of comfort that went beyond professional collaboration. They looked like a couple, like two people who genuinely enjoyed being together. The sight should have devastated Nathaniel, should have triggered the same possessive rage he'd felt at the Winter Gala. Instead, he just felt hollow, watching the woman who used to be his wife smile at something Whitmore said, watching her lean slightly into his touch, watching her be happy in a way she'd never been during their marriage. She deserved that happiness. Deserved someone who looked at her like she hung the moon instead of treating her presence like an inconvenience. He was turning to leave when their eyes met across the gallery. For a moment, neither of them moved. just stood there looking at each other across 30 feet of crowded exhibition space while the rest of the world continued around them. Evelyn's expression was unreadable, but Nathaniel thought he saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or just the tired acknowledgement that they occupied the same social circles and were bound to keep running into each other. Then Whitmore said something and she looked away, breaking the connection, and Nathaniel felt the loss of even that brief eye contact like a physical ache. "Don't," Pemberton murmured beside him. "Don't do whatever you're thinking about doing. I'm not thinking anything. You're thinking about going over there and making a scene. I can see it on your face. I just want to talk to her." "She doesn't want to talk to you." Pemberton's grip on his arm was firm. "She's made that abundantly clear. Respect it." But Nathaniel was already moving, crossing the gallery with single-minded determination, ignoring Pemberton's protests and the renewed whispers his movement triggered. Evelyn saw him coming and stiffened, her hand tightening on Whitmore's arm. The doctor turned and his expression went carefully neutral, positioning himself slightly between Nathaniel and Evelyn in a protective gesture that was probably unconscious. "Your Grace," Whitmore said coolly. "What a surprise. I need a word with Evelyn." Nathaniel's voice came out rougher than intended. "Please. Mrs. Ashford has nothing to say to you." Whitmore's tone was polite but immovable. "I'd appreciate it if you'd respect that." "I'm not asking you, Doctor." Nathaniel locked eyes with Evelyn. "I'm asking her." Evelyn looked between them, and Nathaniel could see the calculation in her eyes, weighing whether making a scene was worse than granting him a brief conversation. Finally, she sighed. "It's fine, Adrian. Just a few minutes." Whitmore looked unhappy but nodded. "I'll be right here if you need me." They moved to a quieter corner of the gallery, away from the worst of the crowd, but still visible enough that propriety was maintained. Evelyn stood with her arms crossed, her expression guarded. "What do you want, Nathaniel? I read your diary." He hadn't planned to lead with that, but the words tumbled out anyway. "The one you sent me. I read it, and I need you to know that I understand now. What I did to you. What I destroyed. And what do you want me to do with that information? Give you absolution? Tell you it's fine?" "No, I don't expect absolution. I wanted you to know that I see it now. See what you tried to give me and how badly I failed to appreciate it." She studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he had to offer. "You look terrible." "I feel terrible. I felt terrible for months. Good." The word was flat, final. "You should feel terrible. You should carry the weight of what you did for the rest of your life, because that's what I did. Carried the weight of not being enough for you, of trying to earn love from someone who decided I wasn't worth the effort." "Evelyn, what—" "Don't." She held up a hand. "Don't try to rewrite this as some tragedy where we were both victims. You made choices. Every single day you chose to treat me like an obligation instead of a partner. You chose Vivian over me. You chose your own misery over trying to build something real with someone who was willing to try. You're right." Nathaniel felt something crumbling inside his chest. "You're absolutely right about all of it. I was selfish and cruel and stupid, and I destroyed something I should have treasured. So why are you telling me this now? Why corner me at an exhibition to confess things I already know? Because I wanted you to hear it from me, that I know what I lost, that I understand I don't deserve your forgiveness, that seeing you with Whitmore made me realize he's giving you everything I should have given you from the beginning." Evelyn's expression flickered, surprise maybe, or pain, or just exhaustion at having to deal with him again when she'd clearly moved on. "Adrian is a good man," she said quietly. "He treats me like I matter, like my thoughts and opinions and dreams are worth listening to. He doesn't make me feel like I have to earn basic respect." "I know. That's what you deserved all along, what you always deserved. Then why didn't you give it to me?" Her voice broke slightly. "Why wasn't I worth that effort when you were my husband?" The question hung between them like an open wound. "Because I was too busy feeling sorry for myself," Nathaniel said finally. "Too consumed with what I'd lost with Vivian to see what I had with you. I convinced myself I was the victim when really I was just a coward who took the easy path and then resented everyone else for it." Evelyn looked away, blinking rapidly. "I don't know what you want me to say, Nathaniel. That I forgive you? I don't. That I understand? I don't. You had 5 years to see my worth, and you didn't. Now it's too late." "I know it's too late." He forced himself to say the words clearly, without the cushion of alcohol or self-pity. I'm not asking for another chance. I'm not asking you to come back or forgive me or even stop hating me. I just wanted you to know that you were right to leave, that you deserve everything good that's happening in your life now. That Whitmore is a lucky man, and I hope he's smart enough to appreciate what I was too blind to see. Something in Evelyn's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but losing some of its defensive edge. That's probably the most honest thing you've ever said to me. It's the least I owe you. You don't owe me anything anymore. The annulment took care of that. We're strangers now, Nathaniel. That's what you wanted, and it's what I need. Across the gallery, Whitmore was watching them with obvious concern, ready to intervene if Evelyn gave any signal. Nathaniel could see the other man's protective stance, the way his attention never wavered from her, and felt something like recognition. This was what it looked like when someone actually cared about Evelyn's well-being instead of viewing her as a convenient accessory. He's good for you, Nathaniel said. Whitmore. I can see it even from here. He is. Evelyn's voice held a warmth it never had when she spoke about Nathaniel. He makes me feel valued, seen, like I'm building something that matters instead of just maintaining appearances. That's all I ever wanted for you. The lie came easily, smoothly, but Nathaniel caught himself before it could land. No. That's what I should have wanted for you. What I actually wanted was for you to be convenient and undemanding while I pursued my own selfish desires. The brutal honesty made Evelyn's eyes widen slightly. I'm trying to be better, Nathaniel continued. Not because I think it'll change anything between us, but because I can't stand being the person I've been. The person who destroyed someone innocent because I was too much of a coward to face my own choices. Then be better. Evelyn straightened her spine. Be better for yourself, for your tenants, for the next woman who's unfortunate enough to care about you. But don't expect me to watch that transformation or celebrate it or give you credit for basic human decency. I'm done being your mirror, Nathaniel. Done reflecting back the version of yourself you want to see. I understand. Do you? Because you've said similar things before and it never lasted. You'd promised to try harder and then go right back to treating me like furniture. This time's different. Why? What's changed? Everything. I lost you. Lost the estate, lost my reputation and my pride and every illusion I'd built about who I was. I hit bottom so hard I went through it into something worse, and the only choice left was whether to keep falling or start climbing. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, and Nathaniel forced himself to meet her gaze without flinching. I hope you make it, she said finally. I genuinely hope you become someone better than the man who married me. But I won't be there to see it, and you need to accept that. I do accept it. That's why I'm not asking you to stay. I'm just saying goodbye properly this time, without the anger or the blame or the desperate attempts to make you responsible for my happiness. Then goodbye, Nathaniel. She turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I never hated you. Even at the worst of it, I just felt sorry for both of us. Me for loving someone who couldn't love me back, and you for being so consumed with what you'd lost that you couldn't see what you had. She walked back to Whitmore, who immediately wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders and guided her toward a different section of the gallery, away from Nathaniel and the tension he'd created. Pemberton appeared at Nathaniel's elbow. Well, that could have gone worse. Could it? You didn't make a scene, didn't beg or threaten or do any of the spectacularly stupid things I thought you might. Pemberton's expression held grudging approval. You actually let her go with something resembling grace. Doesn't feel like grace. Feels like dying. Welcome to consequences. Pemberton steered him toward the exit. Now comes the hard part. Actually becoming the person you claimed you wanted to be. They left the exhibition and stood outside in the spring air that smelled of rain and new growth. London stretched around them, indifferent to one man's personal devastation, continuing its endless cycle of scandal and gossip and casual cruelty. What now? Nathaniel asked. Now you go home. You run your estate properly. You treat your people with respect. You stop drinking yourself to death and start acting like the Duke you're supposed to be. Pemberton's tone was matter-of-fact, and maybe in a few years you'll look back and realize this was the best thing that ever happened to you. Losing the wife you didn't appreciate forced you to become someone who might eventually deserve love, even if it never comes from her. The suggestion felt impossible, ridiculous, so far beyond Nathaniel's current capability that it might as well have been on the moon. But the alternative was continuing to spiral, continuing to destroy himself drink by drink and bad decision by bad decision until there was nothing left worth saving. "Fine," he said. "I'll try." Don't try. Do. Trying is what you've been doing for months, trying to feel better, trying to fix things, trying to earn back what you lost. None of it worked because trying isn't the same as committing. Pemberton's eyes were hard. Commit to being better, all the way, every day. Or don't bother, because half measures will just lead you right back here. They parted ways on the street, Pemberton heading to his club, and Nathaniel back to Blackthorn Manor alone. The house was still empty when he arrived, still echoing with Evelyn's absence in every room she used to occupy. But instead of reaching for the brandy the way he had every night for months, Nathaniel went to his study and pulled out the estate ledgers. If he was going to commit to being better, it had to start with the work he'd been avoiding. The next weeks passed in a blur of grinding, unglamorous labor. Nathaniel threw himself into estate management with grim determination, learning systems Evelyn had built and trying to maintain them in her absence. He met with tenants, approved repairs, balanced accounts, handled the 1,000 small decisions that kept a duchy functioning. It was exhausting and boring, and he was terrible at most of it, but he kept showing up. Harrison, the steward, watched this transformation with obvious skepticism that slowly evolved into cautious approval. "You're actually doing it," Harrison said one afternoon after they'd spent 4 hours going through crop rotation plans. "Learning how to run this place properly. I should have learned years ago." Nathaniel rubbed his eyes tiredly. Evelyn understood all this. "Why didn't I ever ask her to teach me? Because you didn't think estate management was important until you were facing the consequences of your neglect." Harrison's tone held no judgment, just statement of fact. Most aristocrats don't learn these skills until crisis forces them to. That's a damning assessment of our entire class. It is. But you're learning now. That counts for something. Nathaniel wasn't sure it counted for anything beyond preventing another financial disaster, but he kept at it anyway. The social rehabilitation was slower. Society remembered his scandals, his public humiliation of Evelyn, his affair with Vivian. They were willing to tolerate his presence at events now that he'd stopped being actively destructive, but the warmth and automatic respect his title used to command were gone. He had to earn back every inch of standing he'd lost, and the currency was consistent, decent behavior over time. It was humbling in ways he couldn't have imagined a year ago. He started attending parliamentary sessions again, actually paying attention to the debates instead of showing up drunk and leaving early. Started voting on measures that would help tenant farmers in rural communities instead of just protecting aristocratic interests. Started using his position for something beyond personal advancement. People noticed. Not dramatically, not with any grand gestures of forgiveness, but slowly he felt the temperature around him shifting from hostile to neutral to occasionally almost warm. Then June arrived, and with it the announcement that sent London society into gleeful anticipation. Mrs. Evelyn Ashford and Dr. Adrian Whitmore were formally courting, with an engagement expected by summer's end. Nathaniel read the announcement in the morning paper and felt the news settle over him like lead weights. He'd known this was coming, had seen it in the way they looked at each other, the way Whitmore protected her, the way Evelyn smiled when she was with him. But knowing and seeing it printed in black and white were different things. She was moving on completely, building a new life with a man who deserved her, erasing the Blackthorn chapter of her history and replacing it with something better. Pemberton found him that afternoon in his study, staring at the announcement without really seeing it. "You all right?" "No." Nathaniel set the paper down carefully. "But I will be. You could contest it. The annulment was fairly recent. There might be grounds." "No." The word came out sharp, final. "She's happy. I'm not going to destroy that because I can't handle watching her move on." "That's remarkably mature of you. Don't give me too much credit. I'm barely holding it together." Nathaniel stood and walked to the window overlooking the gardens Evelyn had restored. "But she deserves this. Deserves someone who'll love her properly. And I deserve to watch it happen as penance for the years I wasted. Penance isn't the same as growth. Maybe not. But it's all I've got right now." The weeks leading up to the formal engagement announcement were torture. Nathaniel threw himself deeper into estate work, into parliamentary obligations, into anything that might distract him from the constant low-grade agony of knowing Evelyn was planning a future with someone else. He started visiting the tenant families more regularly, actually talking to them about their lives and their challenges. Started understanding that being a duke meant more than collecting rents and attending balls. It meant responsibility for hundreds of lives that depended on his decisions. One evening, he found himself having dinner with the Carsons, a tenant family with 5 children and a farm that had been struggling since the father's injury. Mrs. Carson served simple food with obvious pride, and the children watched Nathaniel with wide eyes like he was some exotic creature who'd wandered into their cottage. "Your Grace has been so generous with the repairs," Mrs. Carson said. "The roof doesn't leak anymore. Makes such a difference come winter. I should have handled it sooner." Nathaniel watched the children eat with the efficient hunger of people who didn't take food for granted. "Your request was sitting in my ledgers for months before I addressed it." "Well, you addressed it now. That's what matters." Mr. Carson's voice was rough from the injury that had damaged his lungs. "The old Duke, your father, he wouldn't have bothered at all. Too grand to care about tenant problems." The assessment stung because it was accurate. His father had viewed tenants as revenue sources, not people. Had instilled in Nathaniel the idea that aristocrats occupied a higher plane of existence that didn't require consideration of those below. Evelyn had never believed that. Had spent years working with tenant families, understanding their needs, advocating for improvements Nathaniel had barely noticed. "She would have loved to see this," Mrs. Carson said, following his gaze to the children. "Her Grace, I mean. She always said you had more compassion than you showed, that you just needed time to see it yourself." "She said that?" Nathaniel's throat felt tight. "All the time." Mrs. Carson's smile was sad. "She defended you even after she left. Said you weren't cruel, just lost. We all thought she was being too kind, making excuses for someone who didn't deserve them. She probably was. Maybe. But she also saw something in you that you're just now finding." Mrs. Carson cleared plates with efficient movements. "Seems a shame she won't be here to see it bear fruit." Nathaniel left the Carson cottage feeling scraped raw, like every protective layer he'd built around himself had been stripped away to expose nerves he didn't know existed. Evelyn had defended him, had made excuses for his behavior to people who would have been justified in their anger, had seen potential in him that he'd spent years proving didn't exist, and now she was marrying someone else who'd probably never need defending because he actually treated her the way she deserved from the beginning. The engagement announcement came in late July, formal and elegant in the society pages. Dr. Adrian Whitmore and Mrs. Evelyn Ashford were pleased to announce their betrothal, with the wedding planned for September at Ashbury. Nathaniel read it alone in his study, the same place where he'd read her diary, where he'd signed the annulment papers, where he'd spent months trying to understand how he'd destroyed something irreplaceable. He should have felt anger or jealousy or the desperate urge to interfere. Instead, he just felt tired, tired of fighting battles he'd already lost, tired of wanting things he'd thrown away, tired of being the villain in a story where he'd cast himself through pure selfishness and stubbornness. He pulled out fresh stationery and began to write. The letter took him 3 hours and a dozen false starts before he got it right. No dramatics, no pleading, no attempts to change her mind. Just honesty stripped of all the protective lies he'd been telling himself. "Evelyn, I saw your engagement announcement. Congratulations. I mean that sincerely. Dr. Whitmore is a good man, and you deserve every happiness he can give you. I'm writing not to interfere, but to say something I should have said years ago. I'm sorry. Sorry for the cruelty, the indifference, the casual destruction of your devotion. Sorry for treating you like an obligation instead of the gift you were. Sorry for wasting 5 years of your life on a man too selfish to appreciate what he had. You tried to love me, and I made that as difficult as possible, and then I had the audacity to resent you for not trying harder. The divorce, the annulment, was the kindest thing you could have done for both of us. You freed yourself from someone who didn't deserve you, and you freed me to finally face who I'd become without the comfortable fiction that I was the wrong party. I'm trying to be better now. Not for you because you've made it clear you want nothing to do with me, but for the people who depend on me, for the tenants whose lives I affect, for whatever comes next in my life, if anything does. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost, and I'll carry that understanding for the rest of my life. I hope your marriage brings you everything ours should have. You deserve joy, Evelyn. You always did. Nathaniel." He sealed the letter and sent it before he could second-guess the impulse. 3 days later, a response arrived. Nathaniel's hands shook as he opened the envelope, uncertain what he'd find inside. The note was brief, written in Evelyn's careful script. "Nathaniel, Thank you for your letter. I appreciate the honesty, though I wish it had come years ago when it might have made a difference. I'm glad you're trying to be better. The tenants deserve it, and so do you. I won't say I forgive you because that would be a lie, but I will say that I no longer carry anger toward you. Just a kind of sad recognition that we were never right for each other, and it took far too long for both of us to accept that. I hope you find peace with yourself. I hope you build a life that means something, and I hope someday you find someone who sees the man you're becoming instead of the one you were. But that someone won't be me. I'm marrying Adrian in September and starting a life that has nothing to do with the Duke of Blackthorn or the woman I was when I carried that title. I wish you well, but from a very great distance. Take care of yourself. Evelyn. Nathaniel read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer next to her diary. She was right. They'd never been right for each other, or more accurately, he'd never been right for her. She tried to make it work through sheer force of will and devotion, but you couldn't build a marriage on one person's effort while the other actively sabotaged it. September arrived with golden light and cooler temperatures, and with it came the week of Evelyn's wedding. Nathaniel hadn't been invited, obviously hadn't been invited, but the entire affair was covered extensively in the society papers for anyone who cared to torture themselves with the details. The ceremony would be at Ashbury, intimate and elegant, with only close friends and family. The reception would support several of Evelyn's charitable initiatives. Dr. Whitmore's colleagues from his medical work would attend alongside local gentry. It sounded perfect. It sounded like everything a wedding should be when two people actually wanted to build a life together. Nathaniel spent the wedding day riding through his estate, avoiding everyone and everything, trying not to think about Evelyn in a white dress, promising forever to someone who'd actually earned the privilege. He failed spectacularly at not thinking about it. The image of her standing at an altar, smiling at Whitmore the way she used to smile at Nathaniel before he'd destroyed that hope, played on endless loop in his mind. The idea of another man taking vows with her, promising to love and cherish her, actually meaning those words and following through, it carved something hollow in Nathaniel's chest that he suspected would never fill. But this was the price of his choices. This was what happened when you threw away something precious because you were too stupid to recognize its value. He got drunk that night, the first time in weeks he'd let himself fall into a bottle, and woke the next morning with a splitting headache and the knowledge that Evelyn was now Mrs. Whitmore, permanently and irrevocably beyond his reach. The pain should have faded, should have dulled with time and distance and the normal healing that came from accepting reality. Instead, it just changed shape, settling into his bones like an old injury that ached whenever the weather shifted. October brought rain and the opening of the new parliamentary session, and Nathaniel threw himself into the work with renewed intensity. He sponsored legislation to improve tenant protections, funded initiatives for rural education, used his wealth and position for something beyond personal indulgence. People noticed. Lord Ashworth himself commented on Nathaniel's transformation at a session, his tone suggesting genuine surprise rather than mockery. "You've changed, Blackthorn. Become almost useful. High praise from you. Don't let it go to your head." Ashworth's expression was calculating. "But I'll admit I didn't expect you to recover from your spectacular self-destruction. Most men would still be wallowing. I tried wallowing. It didn't solve anything." "No, it never does." Ashworth studied him with shrewd eyes. "My wife left me, you know. Vivian. Took half my fortune and ran off with some French comte. Can't say I blame her. I married her for connections and ignored her for business. We get what we pay for in the end." The parallel was obvious, uncomfortable. "Did you try to get her back?" "God, no. Why would I want someone who'd made it clear she couldn't stand me?" Ashworth laughed without humor. "I let her go and focused on what I could actually control, my business empire, my investments, the things that didn't require emotional availability I couldn't provide." "Is that enough?" Nathaniel asked. "Just work and money without anything else?" "Has to be. We're not built for the kind of devotion some people manage. Men like us, we're too selfish, too consumed with our own importance. Better to accept that and work within our limitations than keep destroying people who have the misfortune to care about us." The assessment was brutal, but probably accurate. Nathaniel went home that night to Blackthorn Manor, still echoing and empty despite his efforts to fill the space with purpose and productivity. He'd become a better duke, a more responsible landlord, a more engaged member of Parliament. But the house was still empty, and he was still alone. And somewhere in Ashbury, Evelyn was building a life with someone else that had nothing to do with him at all. The real punishment, Nathaniel was learning, wasn't the public humiliation or the financial crisis or even the loss of Evelyn specifically. It was the knowledge that he'd had everything: love, devotion, partnership, purpose, and he'd ground it to dust through sheer neglect and selfishness. And now he had to live with that knowledge every single day while watching the woman he'd destroyed flourish without him. Some mistakes you fixed, some mistakes you just carried. And the Duke of Blackthorn was learning that his would be a weight he'd bear for the rest of his life, growing heavier with each passing day as the distance between who he'd been and who he was becoming stretched wider. And the woman who'd believed he could bridge that gap built her happiness elsewhere with someone who'd never needed to change to deserve her. They tell you that time heals all wounds, but that's another comfortable fiction people repeat to make suffering feel temporary when the truth is far less forgiving. Time doesn't heal. It just teaches you to carry the weight differently, to redistribute the burden across your shoulders until it becomes part of your skeleton instead of something crushing you from outside. Nathaniel had spent a year learning that lesson in the cruelest classroom imaginable, watching the woman he'd destroyed build a life of genuine happiness while he excavated his own wreckage piece by piece. And somewhere in that brutal education, he discovered that redemption wasn't about earning forgiveness or fixing what you'd broken. It was about becoming someone who understood why the breaking mattered in the first place. The question now wasn't whether Evelyn would ever look at him again without pity or indifference. She wouldn't, and he'd earned that. But whether he could look at himself in the mirror and see something worth salvaging from the ashes of the man who'd traded everything real for a fantasy that evaporated the moment it became tangible. Winter came early that year, bringing frost that turned Blackthorn Manor's grounds into something stark and beautiful in a way Nathaniel had never noticed before. He'd lived in this house his entire life, inherited it from a father who'd viewed it as a symbol of power rather than a home. And only now was he starting to see it as something more than just stone and legacy. The tenants were preparing for the cold months, and Nathaniel found himself involved in those preparations in ways he never had been. Making sure cottages were weatherproofed, ensuring adequate coal supplies, checking that families had resources to survive until spring. It was work Evelyn had done without fanfare for years while he'd been too busy resenting his marriage to notice. Mrs. Carson invited him to their cottage for dinner again in November, and Nathaniel accepted because declining would have been the old version of himself, the Duke too important to break bread with tenant families. The meal was simple but warm, and the children had grown comfortable enough with his presence to actually talk, instead of staring at him like an exotic animal. Tommy, the eldest boy, asked him about Parliament with the earnest curiosity of someone who'd never considered that dukes did actual work beyond existing magnificently. Nathaniel found himself explaining legislation in terms an 11-year-old could understand, watching the boy's face light up with genuine interest. "You make it sound important," Tommy said. "Like it actually matters what you decide." "It does matter. That's what I'm finally learning." Nathaniel accepted another serving of stew from Mrs. Carson. "Every law affects real people. Families like yours. I spent years voting without thinking about who my decisions impacted. And now?" Mr. Carson's damaged voice was curious rather than accusatory. "Now I think about it constantly, probably too much." Nathaniel smiled without humor. Turns out consequences are a powerful teacher. The family exchanged glances that suggested they'd discussed his transformation extensively in private. Mrs. Carson broke the silence with her usual directness. "We heard Mrs. Whitmore had a baby. A little girl." The words hit Nathaniel like a gut punch, even though he'd known Evelyn was pregnant. The announcement had been in the society pages months ago, carefully worded to make clear the child had been conceived well after the marriage. No scandal attached. But hearing it stated so plainly, in a tenant cottage while eating stew, made it real in a way the printed words hadn't. "I hadn't heard," he managed. "That's wonderful news. Due any day now, from what we're told." Mrs. Carson watched him carefully. "She came through here last month, visiting families with Dr. Whitmore. Looked happy, glowing even." The image formed unbidden in Nathaniel's mind. Evelyn pregnant, radiant, building a family with a man who actually deserved her. Starting over completely, with no trace of the Blackthorn years except perhaps as a cautionary tale she'd tell her daughter someday about marrying for the wrong reasons. "I'm glad she's happy," Nathaniel said, and meant it despite the ache in his chest. "She deserves every good thing." "Do you mean that?" Tommy asked with childhood's brutal honesty. "Or are you just saying it because you're supposed to?" Tommy, his mother warned. No, it's all right. Nathaniel met the boy's eyes. I mean it. It took me a long time to understand what I threw away, and even longer to accept that I don't get to have it back just because I finally figured out its value. Mrs. Whitmore, your former Duchess, she gave me years of devotion I didn't earn and didn't appreciate. The fact that she found someone who does appreciate her is probably the only good thing to come out of this entire mess. The family fell silent, and Nathaniel realized he'd said more than he'd intended, revealed more of the wound than was probably appropriate for a dinner conversation. Mr. Carson cleared his throat. That's a hard lesson to learn, Your Grace. Most men never do. Most men don't lose something as comprehensively as I did. Nathaniel pushed food around his plate. Most men don't have their failures documented in society pages for everyone to dissect. Maybe, but most men also don't show up at tenant cottages and eat stew and talk about it honestly. Mrs. Carson's expression was softer now. The old Duke, your father, he'd have considered us beneath his notice. You're trying to be different. That counts for something. Does it? Nathaniel wasn't sure. Sometimes I think I'm just performing a different kind of aristocratic arrogance. The reformed rake, showing everyone how much he's changed. It's still all about me. Is it? Tommy leaned forward. Because you got our roof fixed and my Da says you're pushing for laws that'll help farmers, and you stop drinking yourself to death. Those things help other people, not just you. Out of the mouths of children came assessments that cut through self-deception more effectively than any amount of adult politeness. Nathaniel looked at the boy and felt something shift in his chest. You're right, he said slowly. You're absolutely right. I've been so focused on my own guilt and my own transformation that I've been treating it like another performance, another role to play. So stop performing, Mr. Carson said with his damaged rasp. Just do the work. Help people because it needs doing, not because it makes you feel better about yourself. The brutal simplicity of it was exactly what Nathaniel needed to hear. He left the Carson cottage that evening with a clearer sense of purpose than he'd had in months. Not redemption through grand gestures or public transformation, but just quiet, consistent work that mattered regardless of whether anyone gave him credit for it. December arrived with heavy snow that blanketed the estate in white silence. Nathaniel spent the short days in his study working through proposals for tenant improvements, and the long evenings reading, not the political treatises he used to favor, but novels and philosophy and anything that might help him understand how to be a better human being instead of just a more effective duke. Pemberton visited for Christmas, bringing news from London along with expensive brandy Nathaniel barely touched. Society's moved on, Pemberton reported over dinner. You're no longer the scandal of the season. Summerall ran off with his sister-in-law, and everyone's talking about that instead. Good. Nathaniel had no appetite for the roast Thomas had prepared. I never wanted to be interesting for the wrong reasons. You're becoming interesting for the right ones, though. Pemberton cut his meat with precision. That bill you sponsored about tenant protections, it's gaining traction. People are noticing you're not just mouthing platitudes. I hope it passes. Those protections are decades overdue. They are. But the fact that you're championing them, given your history of ignoring tenant welfare, makes the gesture more powerful. Pemberton paused. Reformations are always more compelling than consistent virtue. I'm not interested in being compelling. Nathaniel met his friend's eyes. I'm interested in actually fixing the damage I caused through years of negligence. That's what I mean. You've stopped performing. Pemberton's expression held something like respect. Last year, you were drowning in self-pity and desperate for everyone to acknowledge your suffering. Now you're just doing the work without fanfare. That's actual change. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. That's how you know it's real. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only came from friendship that had survived scandal and mutual disappointment and come out stronger on the other side. I heard the Whitmores had a daughter, Pemberton said eventually. Healthy birth, mother and child both well. I heard. Nathaniel's voice was steady despite the tightness in his chest. I'm glad. Are you? Truly? Yes. Nathaniel considered the question honestly. Part of me will always ache about what I lost, but Evelyn deserves that happiness, deserves a family with someone who wanted her from the beginning instead of resenting her for not being someone else. That's remarkably mature of you. Don't give me too much credit. I still have days where I want to rage at the unfairness of it all. Want to blame everyone but myself for how things turned out. Nathaniel smiled bitterly. But those days are getting rarer. Mostly I just feel tired and grateful she escaped before I could damage her more than I already did. Pemberton studied him across the table. What will you do? Long term? Keep working. Keep learning. Try to become someone who might eventually deserve a second chance at life, even if it never includes her. Nathaniel shrugged. What else is there? You could remarry, rebuild, start fresh with someone new. No. The word came out sharp, final. I'm done inflicting myself on women who have the misfortune to believe I might be worth the effort. Evelyn survived me. I won't risk destroying someone else. That's a lonely road. Yes, but it's the appropriate one. They finished dinner in contemplative silence, and Pemberton left the next morning with promises to visit again in spring. Nathaniel spent the rest of winter in productive isolation, working on estate improvements and parliamentary business with single-minded focus that filled his days but left his nights empty. He'd stopped drinking to excess, stopped wallowing, stopped most of the self-destructive behaviors that had defined the worst months of his fall. But he hadn't figured out how to stop missing Evelyn in the quiet moments when there was nothing to distract him from the magnitude of what he'd lost. Spring arrived with tentative warmth and the estate coming back to life. Nathaniel rode through his lands and saw the improvements he'd funded over the winter. Repaired cottages, new drainage systems, better roads. Tangible evidence that he was trying to be better than the Duke who'd let everything slide while he pursued his own selfish desires. The tenants were cautiously optimistic about the changes, and Nathaniel accepted their thanks with the understanding that he was just correcting years of neglect rather than doing anything particularly heroic. Tommy Carson had started reading law books Nathaniel had loaned him, showing a sharp mind that deserved better education than the local school could provide. Nathaniel quietly arranged for a scholarship to a better institution, telling the family it was funding available to promising students, not charity from a guilty duke trying to buy absolution. Mrs. Carson saw through the fiction but accepted it with grace. "You're trying to make a difference," she said one afternoon when Nathaniel stopped by to check on the family. "That's all any of us can do." "Is it enough? Making small differences for a handful of people? It's enough for those people." Mrs. Carson's expression was kind. "You're looking for grand redemption, Your Grace. Some dramatic moment where everything's forgiven and you're restored to who you were before. But that's not how it works." "Then how does it work?" "You just keep showing up, keep doing better, keep helping where you can. And eventually you look back and realize you've built something worthwhile from the ruins." Mrs. Carson handed him tea with work-roughened hands. "The person you were before. The one who had everything and threw it away. He's gone. You can't get him back. But you can build someone new from what's left." The wisdom of it struck Nathaniel deeply. He'd been trying to reclaim his old life, his old standing, as if returning to who he'd been before the fall was the goal. But Mrs. Carson was right. That person was gone, and good riddance. The Duke who'd married Evelyn and destroyed her through casual cruelty didn't deserve resurrection. Better to build something new entirely. He spent the spring doing exactly that, not trying to reclaim his old reputation, but slowly constructing a new one through consistent action. More tenant improvements, more progressive legislation, more genuine engagement with the responsibilities his title demanded. London society noticed. Invitations started arriving again, not with the automatic assumption of his presence, but with genuine interest in his opinions on policy matters. He'd become known as the Reformed Duke, the aristocrat who'd hit bottom and climbed back up with actual substance instead of just restored appearances. It was uncomfortable being the subject of admiration for surviving consequences of his own making, but Nathaniel accepted it as part of the price of redemption. Then May brought news that stopped him cold. Pemberton arrived at Blackthorn Manor unannounced, his round face grave in a way that immediately set Nathaniel's nerves on edge. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly." Pemberton accepted brandy he didn't drink. "But something's happening you should know about. Just tell me. The Whitmores are coming to London for the season, bringing the baby. Evelyn wants to introduce her daughter to society before they return to Ashbury permanently." Nathaniel felt the blood drain from his face. "She's coming here? To London?" "For about 6 weeks. They've taken a house in Mayfair." Pemberton watched him carefully. "You'll inevitably run into them at social events. I thought you should have time to prepare. Prepare." As if there was any way to prepare for seeing Evelyn again after more than a year, seeing her happy and settled with another man's child in her arms, seeing everything he'd thrown away reconstructed into something better without him. Thank you for the warning, Nathaniel managed. What will you do? What can I do? Avoid her would be cowardly. Confront her would be inappropriate. I'll do what I've been doing, stay out of her way and hope she finds London hospitable enough that my presence doesn't ruin it for her. That's very restrained of you. Restraint is all I have left. Nathaniel finally took a drink, welcoming the burn. Everything else I've already lost. The Whitmores arrived in London in mid-May, and Nathaniel felt the ripple of their presence through society like a stone dropped in still water. Evelyn had become something of a celebrity in the years since her remarriage, the reformed duchess who'd escaped an unhappy marriage to build something meaningful with a country doctor, who'd started charitable foundations that actually helped people, who'd proved that women could thrive outside the suffocating confines of aristocratic expectation. She was everything Nathaniel had prevented her from being during their marriage, and society loved her for it. He saw her first at a garden party in early June across a manicured lawn filled with London's finest. She wore pale green that brought out her eyes and made her look younger than he remembered, more vibrant. The baby, Charlotte, he'd learned, was with a nurse somewhere inside, but Evelyn's entire demeanor radiated the contentment of new motherhood. Whitmore stood beside her with his hand resting on the small of her back, the same protective gesture Nathaniel had noticed at the winter gala, and they were surrounded by well-wishers congratulating them on their daughter and their obvious happiness. Nathaniel watched from a distance and felt the familiar ache in his chest that he'd learned to carry like an old war wound, painful but manageable, a permanent part of his landscape. He was turning to leave when their eyes met across the garden. For a moment, neither of them moved, just stood there looking at each other while conversations flowed around them, and the spring sun beat down on perfectly maintained grass. Evelyn's expression was unreadable. Not hostile, not welcoming, just careful, the look of someone who'd moved on but hadn't forgotten. Nathaniel gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, nothing more. Just recognition that they existed in the same world, and he wasn't going to make that fact difficult for her. She returned the nod with equal restraint, then turned back to her conversation with Whitmore, dismissing him as gently and completely as one might dismiss a stranger. It was the right response, the appropriate one, but it still felt like a door closing. Pemberton found him at the edge of the garden looking miserable. That went well. Did it? You didn't cause a scene. Didn't try to talk to her or make it weird. You acknowledged her existence and moved on. Pemberton's tone was approving. That's growth. Doesn't feel like growth. Feels like cowardice. Sometimes they're the same thing. Knowing when to step back and let someone live their life without your interference, that's not cowardice, that's respect. The distinction felt academic, but Nathaniel didn't argue. He managed to avoid direct interaction with the Whitmores for 3 weeks through careful social maneuvering and well-timed exits. He saw Evelyn at various events, always from a distance, always with Whitmore beside her looking proud and protective, and everything Nathaniel had failed to be. The baby made her first official appearance at a charity luncheon in late June, and society cooed appropriately over the healthy infant with her mother's eyes and her father's serious expression. Nathaniel heard the chatter secondhand from Pemberton, refusing to attend events where he might accidentally intrude on Evelyn's maternal happiness. Then July brought the invitation that changed everything. It arrived on heavy cardstock, formally addressed to the Duke of Blackthorn, and Nathaniel's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Dr. and Mrs. Adrian Whitmore cordially invite you to a reception celebrating the christening of their daughter, Charlotte Evelyn Whitmore, to be held at Whitmore House on the 15th of July. Evelyn had named her daughter after herself, had passed on her own name to a child who would grow up loved and wanted and cherished by parents who'd chosen each other freely. The symbolism wasn't lost on Nathaniel. This was Evelyn's fresh start made flesh, the life she'd built from the ashes of their failed marriage, and she'd invited him to witness it. He stared at the invitation for a long time, trying to understand why, trying to parse whether this was an olive branch or just social obligation, whether Evelyn genuinely wanted him there, or whether excluding the Duke of Blackthorn from a major social event would have raised questions she didn't want to answer. Pemberton found him that evening still holding the invitation like it might explode. "Are you going?" "I don't know." Nathaniel set it down carefully. "Why would she invite me? We haven't spoken in over a year. I signed away any claim to her life. Maybe that's exactly why. You let her go, didn't fight the annulment, didn't make her departure difficult, didn't try to interfere with her happiness." Pemberton settled into a chair. Maybe she's acknowledging that you finally did one thing right by inviting me to celebrate the family I'll never have with her. By showing you she's moved past whatever anger she had, that she's happy enough in her new life that your presence doesn't threaten it. The assessment made a brutal kind of sense. Evelyn had no reason to fear him anymore. He couldn't hurt her, couldn't touch her, couldn't do anything but witness the life she'd built without him. Maybe that was the point. Maybe this was her final statement. Look what I became when you stopped holding me back. I'll go, Nathaniel decided. I owe her that much. One afternoon of celebrating her happiness without making it about my regrets. The day of the reception arrived with summer heat that made London feel oppressive. Nathaniel dressed carefully in clothes that were elegant but not ostentatious, wanting to blend into the background rather than draw attention. Whitmore House was smaller than Blackthorn Manor but warmer somehow, filled with light and flowers and the kind of lived-in comfort that came from people who actually enjoyed their home. Guests filled the gardens where tables had been set up with champagne and delicate foods, and the whole affair felt intimate despite the crowd, like a celebration among friends rather than a social obligation among aristocrats. Nathaniel arrived late deliberately, slipping into the garden and accepting champagne from a servant who didn't recognize him. He found a spot near the back where he could observe without participating, watching Evelyn move through her guests with Charlotte in her arms. She looked radiant in pale blue silk, her dark hair swept up, diamonds catching the sunlight. But more than that, she looked at peace, the kind of deep contentment that came from being exactly where you wanted to be with exactly who you wanted beside you. Whitmore hovered nearby, introducing colleagues and accepting congratulations with the genuine warmth of someone who'd never doubted his right to this happiness. They looked perfect together, like two pieces that had always been meant to fit. Nathaniel watched them for 20 minutes, feeling like a ghost haunting a life that had moved on without him, wondering if he should just leave before anyone noticed his presence. Then Evelyn saw him. She'd been laughing at something Lady Ashbury had said, her head thrown back in unguarded joy, and her eyes had swept across the garden in that unconscious way people did when they were happy and wanted to share it with everyone present. Her gaze landed on Nathaniel and held. The laughter faded from her face, replaced by surprise, and then something more complicated. Recognition, assessment, the careful evaluation of whether his presence was going to be a problem. Nathaniel gave her the same small nod he'd given at the garden party. Acknowledgement without intrusion. Then he set down his untouched champagne and turned to leave. Nathaniel. Her voice stopped him cold. He turned back slowly and found her walking toward him, Charlotte still in her arms, Whitmore a few steps behind looking protective, but not hostile. They stood facing each other in a quiet corner of the garden while the party continued around them, and Nathaniel couldn't find words that felt adequate to the moment. "You came?" Evelyn said finally. "You invited me. I wasn't sure you meant it." "I meant it." She shifted Charlotte slightly, and the baby made a small sound that drew everyone's attention. "I wanted you to see that I'm happy. Truly, genuinely happy in a way I never was before." The words should have devastated him. Instead, they just felt true. "I can see that," he said quietly. "You're radiant, both of you." Whitmore's hand settled on Evelyn's shoulder, a casual gesture of connection that spoke volumes about their relationship. The doctor's expression was calm, assessing, giving Nathaniel the space to prove whether he was a threat or just a ghost from Evelyn's past. "Congratulations on your daughter," Nathaniel continued. "Charlotte Evelyn, that's a beautiful name. We wanted to honor fresh starts." Evelyn's green eyes were steady. Charlotte for Adrian's mother, Evelyn for the woman I've become instead of the one I was. The distinction was deliberate, pointed, a reminder that the Evelyn who'd been Duchess of Blackthorn no longer existed, had been replaced by someone stronger, happier, more complete. "She suits you both," Nathaniel said. "I hope she inherits your kindness and Dr. Whitmore's integrity." "That's generous of you." Whitmore spoke for the first time, his voice measured. "I wasn't sure what to expect when Evelyn insisted on inviting you." "Why did you?" Nathaniel asked, looking at Evelyn. "Invite me, I mean. We haven't spoken since the annulment, because I needed to see if it still hurt." Evelyn's honesty was characteristically direct. "Needed to know if having you here would disturb my peace, or if I'd moved past it completely." "And?" Nathaniel wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "And I've moved past it." Evelyn's smile was sad but genuine. "You're part of my history, Nathaniel, but you're not part of my present. Seeing you here, seeing you respectful and distant and clearly trying to be better. It doesn't hurt anymore. It just feels like looking at someone I used to know. The assessment should have stung. Instead, it felt like absolution. I'm glad, Nathaniel said softly. Glad you found this. Found him. Found yourself. So am I. Evelyn adjusted Charlotte again, and Nathaniel caught a glimpse of the baby's face, serious and alert, already showing signs of her mother's intelligence. I won't lie and say I'm grateful for what you put me through, but I'm grateful for where it led me, for the strength I found when I stopped waiting for you to give me value. You always had value. I was just too blind to see it. Yes, you were. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. But you're seeing things more clearly now, I think. The reports from Blackthorn say you've become a decent landlord, that you're actually helping people instead of just extracting rents. I'm trying. It doesn't feel like enough, but I'm trying. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better than we were. Whitmore cleared his throat gently. Evelyn, we should get Charlotte inside. She's getting fussy. Of course. Evelyn looked at Nathaniel one last time, and her expression held something like peace. Thank you for coming, Nathaniel, for respecting boundaries and not making this difficult. It means more than you probably realize. Thank you for inviting me, for giving me the chance to see you happy. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it anyway. We both deserve to move forward. Evelyn started to turn away, then paused. I hope you find peace with yourself. I genuinely mean that. You were a terrible husband, but you're not a terrible person. You just need to figure out who you are when you're not trying to be someone's disappointment. She walked away with Whitmore, heading inside with their daughter, leaving Nathaniel standing in the garden with those final words echoing in his head. You're not a terrible person. You just need to figure out who you are when you're not trying to be someone's disappointment. It was the most generous assessment anyone had given him in years, and it came from the woman who had every right to hate him most. Nathaniel left the reception quietly, slipping out through a side gate without saying goodbye to anyone. The walk back to his townhouse took him through Hyde Park, and he found himself drawn to the same paths he and Evelyn used to ride during the early days of their marriage. He'd been thinking about redemption all wrong, he realized. Thinking it was something you earned through sufficient suffering or good works or public transformation. But redemption wasn't a destination you reached. It was just the daily choice to be better than you were, to help where you could, to carry your mistakes without letting them crush you completely. Evelyn had given him that gift today without realizing it. Not forgiveness. She'd been clear that wasn't on offer, and he didn't deserve it anyway, but permission to stop flagellating himself and start actually living with purpose instead of just performing penance. He could be a good duke, a responsible landlord, a man who used his position to help rather than exploit. Not because it would erase what he'd done to Evelyn, but because it was the right thing regardless of whether anyone gave him credit. The days that followed brought a strange kind of peace. Nathaniel returned to Blackthorn Manor at summer's end and threw himself into work with renewed clarity. The tenant improvements continued. The parliamentary advocacy expanded. The slow, unglamorous work of being decent accumulated into something that might eventually resemble a meaningful legacy. Tommy Carson came to him in September with news that he'd been accepted to the school Nathaniel had arranged, his young face bright with excitement and possibility. This is going to change my life, Your Grace. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just use the opportunity well. Nathaniel felt something like pride watching the boy's enthusiasm, and maybe someday pay it forward for someone else who needs a chance. I will. I promise. The kid meant it too. Nathaniel could see it in his eyes. The kind of fierce determination that came from understanding opportunity was precious because it was rare. Mrs. Carson pulled Nathaniel aside as he was leaving. You gave him hope, Your Grace. Gave our whole family hope that things could be different. I just opened a door. He has to walk through it himself, but you opened it. That matters. Mrs. Carson's work-roughened hand squeezed his briefly. The Duchess, Mrs. Whitmore, I mean. She'd be proud of what you're doing, even if she can't say it. The words settled somewhere deep in Nathaniel's chest, in the place where he kept the complicated mix of grief and gratitude that defined his relationship with his own past. Maybe Evelyn would be proud. Maybe not. It didn't really matter because he wasn't doing this for her approval or even for his own redemption. He was doing it because it needed doing, and he was in a position to make it happen, and that was reason enough. Autumn passed into winter again, the cycle of seasons marking another year in his slow transformation from the man who destroyed everything to the man who was building something worth keeping from the ruins. Pemberton visited for Christmas again, bringing news and companionship and the comfortable acceptance of friendship that had survived scandal. "You've changed," Pemberton said over dinner, not dramatically, just steadily, like water wearing down stone. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. The most profound changes are the quiet ones. Pemberton raised his glass. To steady improvement and water wearing down stone. To survival, Nathaniel countered, and learning to live with consequences. They drank to that, and Nathaniel felt the weight of the year settling over him like a blanket. Heavy, but not crushing. Significant, but manageable. He'd lost everything that mattered. His wife, his reputation, nearly his entire estate. He'd faced the complete collapse of the life he'd built on selfishness and entitlement and casual cruelty. And somehow he'd survived it. Somehow he'd crawled out of the wreckage and started building something new from the pieces that remained. It wasn't the life he'd imagined. It wasn't the triumphant story of redemption where the fallen hero earned back everything he'd lost through sufficient suffering and grand gestures. It was smaller than that, quieter. Just the daily work of being decent when no one was watching, of helping where he could, of carrying his mistakes without letting them define every choice going forward. The reports from Ashbury said the Whitmores were thriving. Evelyn had opened 2 more charitable foundations. Dr. Whitmore's medical work was expanding to cover 3 counties. Charlotte was growing healthy and happy, surrounded by parents who'd chosen each other and chosen her with equal intentionality. Nathaniel read those reports and felt the ache of permanent loss mixed with genuine gladness that Evelyn had found what she deserved. Some mistakes you couldn't fix. Some damage was too profound to repair. Some losses had to be carried as the price of the person you'd been when you inflicted them. But you could still build something worthwhile from what remained. Could still choose to be better, even if better would never be good enough to erase the past. Spring came again, bringing renewal to Blackthorn Manor's grounds, and the promise of another planting season for tenant families who were starting to trust that their duke actually cared about their welfare. Nathaniel rode through his estate on a morning in late April when the world felt fresh and possible, and he thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago, arrogant, entitled, so consumed with his own dissatisfaction that he destroyed the one person who genuinely loved him. That man was gone, had died in the wreckage of his own making, replaced by someone quieter, more careful, more aware of how much damage thoughtless cruelty could inflict. The new man wasn't better in any romantic sense, wasn't redeemed or forgiven or granted some Hollywood ending where everything worked out. He was just trying to help, trying to do less harm, trying to build a legacy that meant something beyond inherited titles and accumulated wealth. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could really do, survive their mistakes, learn from the wreckage, and keep showing up to do better even when better would never erase what came before. Nathaniel reined in his horse at the top of a hill overlooking his estate, and for the first time in years he felt something close to peace. Not happiness. He'd forfeited any claim to easy happiness when he'd thrown away Evelyn's love. But peace, the quiet acceptance that this was his life now. These were his choices. This was the path forward. Alone but purposeful. Scarred but functional. Carrying the weight of permanent loss while still building something that mattered. It wasn't the ending he'd wanted, but it was the ending he'd earned, and there was a strange dignity in accepting that without the comfortable cushion of self-deception or the desperate hope that things might still somehow work out. He'd lost the greatest love he'd ever have, had watched her build a beautiful life with someone who deserved her, had faced the complete destruction of everything he'd taken for granted, and he'd survived it, had learned from it, had become someone who might eventually deserve a second chance at life, even if it would never include the woman who taught him what real devotion looked like. The Duke of Blackthorn turned his horse back toward the manor, toward the work waiting in his study, toward the tenants who depended on his decisions, toward the future he was building one quiet choice at a time. Behind him, the past stretched out like a landscape of ashes and lessons learned too late. Ahead, the path narrowed into something smaller than he'd imagined, but more honest than anything he'd built before. And in the distance, in a house in Ashbury he'd never visit, Evelyn Whitmore lived a life of genuine happiness with a husband who cherished her, and a daughter who would grow up knowing she was wanted. Nathaniel carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest, heavy, permanent, a constant reminder of what happened when you mistook possession for love and entitlement for devotion. Some men learned these lessons early enough to salvage what mattered. Nathaniel had learned them too late for salvation, but just in time to become someone who understood why salvation had always been beyond his reach. And in that understanding, in that brutal acceptance of permanent consequences, he found something that wasn't redemption or forgiveness or any of the comfortable endings people wrote in books. Just the quiet discipline of continuing, of doing better, of building something worth leaving behind even though the person who'd believed he could would never see it. The silence of Blackthorn Manor welcomed him home, and Nathaniel accepted it as the only companion his choices had left him. Some loves you got to keep, some loves you destroyed, and some loves haunted you forever with the ghost of what you'd thrown away when you were too blind to see it was the only real thing you'd ever have. He'd live with that, would carry it until the day he died, would build his legacy around the shape of her absence and hope that somewhere in the work, in the helping, in the daily choice to be less terrible than he'd been, there might be something resembling meaning. It was a lonely road, a hard road, a road that led nowhere he'd once wanted to go. But it was the only road left to him, and he'd walk it with whatever grace he could muster, carrying the weight of his mistakes like the inheritance they were, permanent, immutable, and entirely his own fault. The Duke of Blackthorn had finally learned what power really meant. Not control, not dominance, not the ability to command others or bend them to your will, just the capacity to choose differently, to build instead of destroy, to help instead of harm, and to live with the consequences of every moment you'd chosen wrong, carrying them forward without letting them stop you from choosing right the next time. It wasn't redemption, but it was survival. And survival, he was learning, was its own kind of victory when you'd fallen as far as he had and still managed to stand back up.